Buenos días, bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenides a este segundo simposio de Género y Comportamiento Humano. Mi nombre es Cecilia Calero y soy la directora del área de educación de la Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. Y hoy quiero comenzar este simposio, primero que nada agradeciendo a la International Brain Research Organization, que este año, por segunda vez, me otorgó el libro de Diversity Grant, el cual nos permite, junto a la colaboración de la universidad, y en particular a todo el trabajo que hicieron Ileana Minutela, Verónica Stuart, Julieta Goldstein y 𝘍𝘪𝘯𝘬, posible que estemos hoy acá. Y quiero agradecerles, por supuesto, a ustedes por estar acá, probablemente, espero que una vez más, que también hayan estado el año pasado, acompañándonos en este día que de nuevo es muy importante para nuestra área y creo que para la región en general. Este segundo simposio sobre género y comportamiento humano, les decía el año pasado, y este año me pone muy contenta volver a decir que va a contar con la participación de investigadoras de primer nivel, nacionales e internacionales, personas que no solamente están involucradas y absolutamente comprometidas en impactar en el ámbito académico, sumando datos, sumando información con sus investigaciones, sino que también están muy interesadas y preocupadas en que esa información le llegue a la mayor cantidad de gente posible, y se sumaron desde el primer mail, el primer contacto, dijeron que sí a participar de este simposio, así que gracias a ellas también. El año pasado también les decía que este simposio estaba pensado para interpelarnos, para ponernos incómodos, incómodas, incómodes, y para llevar la discusión a otros lados, para tratar de pensar temas de género, temas de diversidad, de equidad, de perspectiva de género, pero con una mirada que incluya a las ciencias del comportamiento, que son las que me han formado y deformado durante estos años, y que nos permiten de alguna manera poner sobre la mesa y comenzar a abrir un debate con una perspectiva que está basada en la evidencia, lo cual nos permite repensar algunas ideas desde otro lado, que creo que es lo que es interesante, hacer sinergia con otros espacios que están por ahí discutiendo estos temas desde otro lado. Y también me parece que un espacio como este es realmente importante, y quiero remarcar esto fuertemente, porque es una manera de promover y de mostrar la necesidad de financiar programas de investigación que estén focalizados en estos temas. ¿Para qué? Bueno, para que sean útiles, para mejorar nuestras políticas educativas, y como vamos a hablar bastante en este simposio, para fortalecer la enseñanza de la Ley de Educación Sexual Integral, con datos, ¿sí? Basados en evidencia. Así que espero que las charlas de hoy nos dejen con algunos datos y con un montón de preguntas que nos den ganas de seguir aprendiendo, que nos den ganas de seguir buscando información, y sobre todo que nos empuje a poner sobre nuestras agendas personales y de trabajo estas discusiones sobre la mesa. Así que bueno, muchas gracias, y las organizadoras de este simposio y yo les agradecemos su participación hoy, así que gracias por estar ahí. Bueno, y ahora, antes de cambiar el idioma, voy a pasar a dos datos importantes. El primero es que pueden ir a lo largo de todo el simposio dejando sus preguntas, y tanto yo como, bueno, el burro primero, tanto Ileana Minutela como yo, vamos a ir tomando sus preguntas y sus comentarios en el chat para ir pasándoselos a las distintas charlistas de la mañana. Y la segunda es que este simposio cuenta con con traducción simultánea, así que si van, señalo para abajo, pero no sé de qué lado está, va a haber como un mundito en donde pueden apretar y elegir el idioma. Pueden elegir el audio original, pueden elegir inglés o pueden elegir español, así que elijan el que les quede más cómodo. So that's allowed me to switch now to English. I'm going to be going back and forward if you are hearing in the original audio. And I'm changing to English to welcome Susan Gelman. Hi, Susan. I saw that you were there. Hey.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here today. Susan was the first one to say yes, so I'm super happy. It's a privilege, it's an honor having you to giving the keynote speaker a talk at the symposium. So thank you very much, Susan.
My pleasure.
For those who don't know her, probably everybody knows her, but I'm going to do the thing that you do at the beginning. So for those who don't know her, Susan is the 𝘱𝘪𝘯𝘬𝘕 Distinguished University Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan. She received her PhD in psychology from Stanford University. Professor Hellman conducts research on concepts and language in young children. Her research examines how categories guide children's reasoning, how children discover and reason about not obvious aspects of the world and the role of language in those processes. She has been honored. She has a lot of honors and awards. Some of them are by the American Psychological Association with the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award, the award for distinguished contributions to developmental psychology, and the Developmental Psychology Mentor Award. So just to name a few. And she's a member of the U.S. National Academy of Science. She has a lot of research done. I use that research for my lectures. I read that a lot of those papers. But today I want to focus on her book called The Essential Child: Origins of Essentialism in Everyday Thought, which is like a remarkable piece of literature. If you haven't read it, you should go and check the book. And I was doing a little bit of stalking, so I read that in Wikipedia. It says that you have more than 2,000 cited, but I checked it and now it's more than 2,500, so amazing. And today she will be presenting a talk entitled Beyond Pink and Blue Brains, How Essentialism Biases How We Think About Gender. So thank you very much, Susan, for being here, and the Zoom is all yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen now, and then you can let me know if it is showing up okay. How does that look?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and especially for organizing this symposium. I think it's so important that you're bringing attention to these issues regarding gender gaps in STEM and gender stereotypes and gender inequities more broadly. And I'm really honored to be able to speak with you all today. So the title of my talk is Beyond Pink and Blue Brains, How Essentialism Biases How We Think About Gender. And really the message that I have in the time that I have with you today is very simple. I think when people think about gender, they tend toward this cognitive bias that I call essentialism. And I'll tell you what that is in a little while, but the point that I want you to take away is that this cognitive bias is very powerful, it's stubborn, and it's widespread. And it's contributing to gender stereotyping and to gender inequities. My hope is that if we understand this bias, if we're aware of it and how it operates, then we can push back against it and make positive changes in the world. So here's the plan for my talk. First, I'll present the problem, which I'm calling Pink and Blue Brains. You'll see why in a second. Then I'm going to describe this cognitive bias known as essentialism and explain how I think it contributes to the problem. Then I will review research on why we essentialize, including how essentialism is transmitted from one person to another in a given culture. And finally, I'll draw some conclusions and hopefully have time for questions at the end. Okay, so Pink and Blue Brains. So I was very pleased to watch the video from last year's conference. And there were two wonderful talks by neuroscientists, Gina Rippon and Lisa Elliott. And they both had a very important message. They reviewed extensive research showing that neuroscience research examining the brains of men and women show that men and women are overwhelmingly similar in terms of brain structure, brain connections, and so forth. And in fact, you can't predict whether someone is a man or a woman by looking at their brain. However, over and over and over again, the brains of men and women are presented as if they're completely different. And I use the phrase pink and blue brains because that is the title of Lisa Elliott's book, where she examines this tendency. So this is an example. If the top picture is supposed to be a man's brain, the bottom picture is supposed to be a woman's brain. But if you read the article that this came from carefully, you see that the authors depicted only differences and left out any similarities between male and female brains. If you were to include the many, many, many similarities, that would quite swamp the differences that they obtained. Here's another example. Male and female brain differences confirmed by new findings, and the image that went along with it on the website was literally brains of different colors. Here's another image from my wonderful alma mater, Stanford University. This is from the medical school. There was research examining cognitive differences between men and women, and they decided to illustrate that with a pink brain and a blue brain. This was another visual that accompanied a news article regarding a neuroscience finding examining, again, men and women and their brain activation. And just in popular culture, we see over and over again, it was fun for a while to find these images, and then ultimately I just had to stop because there were too many of them. So we might ask, you know, given this almost complete overlap between men and women's brains, why do people so easily think about gender in terms of pink and blue brains? And I'm going to suggest that one root cause to this is a very general cognitive bias that we have, which I call essentialism. Now, I'm going to illustrate this initially with an example that has nothing to do with gender, but then talk about how it links up with beliefs about gender. So essentialism is the idea that certain categories in nature have an underlying hidden essence. So if you look at this very cute wolf pup, we know that it's going to grow up to be a ferocious beast because it is a wolf, even though it looks adorable now. And we also know that it has, or we believe it has an innate predisposition that's going to come out at some point in its development. And that would be true regardless of how it's raised. Even if it's raised in a human household, it's going to be dangerous when it grows up. So we could graph this idea something like this. The idea is that what makes this a wolf is not just its outward features. It has a deeper reality as well. And there's some inborn, unchanging quality that makes it a wolf and that all and only wolves share. And that's what we can call its essence. So this is sort of like the mini mental model that we have in our heads. Now, what is that essence? You might think it's the wolf DNA. You may think it's something that runs through its blood, or you may not even know what the essence is. You may just have a belief that there's something in there that causes it to develop the way it does. So as I said, it's like a miniature theory about the categories that we form. Now, it's important to realize that essentialism is a cognitive bias. Now, it might seem fine to think about wolves as having some innate predisposition, but when essentialism is applied to people, it can be very problematic. It can oversimplify, it can lead to misconceptions, And I'll give just two brief examples. This quote is from a research study that examined how ordinary US participants thought about genetics, and they looked at a number of different beliefs, and the researchers included this question where people were asked to agree or disagree with this statement: two people from the same race will always be more genetically similar to each other than two people from different races. This is utterly false, but it's an essentialist view that says if you're a member of a given racial group, there must be some internal genetic essence that causes you to become a member of that group. And most of the participants who were surveyed, so large national survey, agreed with this statement. Here's another example. In India, some people make use of a caste system, and according to this belief system, social distinctions are viewed as natural, inevitable, and fixed. If you're a member of a certain caste, you cannot change. Now, there's been a lot of progress in recent years in India, sort of against the caste system, but it's a sort of structural belief system that's a biased way of thinking about human difference. Okay, now what about gender? So a gender essentialist will look at this newborn baby and say, because he's a boy, he has a biological essence encoded in his chromosomes, and this inner essence determines not only his biological features, but also a host of deeper features as well. So again, this sort of mental model of the category. And so an essentialist would believe that this baby's chromosomes will determine his preferences, his abilities, his personality, his intelligence, and his brain, and in a way that contrasts with a girl baby. And again, just like with the example that I provided earlier of race, or caste, when we essentialize gender, again, it's a problem. So I'm going to just kind of review some gender essentialist beliefs and contrast them with the reality that shows that the essentialist beliefs are problematic. A gender essentialist would say that men and women are opposites, whereas in reality, men and women are largely alike. And this is true not only in analyses of brains, but also in a lot of social psychological research looking at various attributes. A gender essentialist would say that women are all the same and men are all the same, whereas in reality, there's tremendous variability among women and among men. A gender essentialist would say that a whole host of gender differences are biological, whereas in reality, there are cultural, structural, and social forces at work. And a gender essentialist would say that gender disparities, more men in STEM fields, for example, are natural, whereas in reality, gender disparities can and have changed over time and in different cultural contexts and with different sorts of environments. Furthermore, higher gender essentialism predicts various problematic outcomes. Higher gender essentialism predicts gender stereotyping, prejudice against gender nonconforming individuals, gender imbalances in STEM. So people who think that fields in which the dominant belief is that success in the field requires innate brilliance are those fields with the greatest gender imbalances. And also we found that gender essentialism predicts support for gender exclusionary policies. So in the US, for example, there have been bills introduced into law to require that bathrooms are used only for people based on their sex at birth, so that a trans person is unable to use the bathroom that they would prefer to use. And this is tied into essentialist beliefs. Okay, so, essentialism is this powerful idea, and it's a problem. So why are we doing it? And this is something that I've looked at for many years. And as Cecilia mentioned, my approach is to examine this from a developmental perspective. I look at where these beliefs come from in children to see how much of sort of a basic tendency do we have when we form categories to assume essentialism. So we bring children into the lab or into research spaces at local museums, or in the last couple of years, we've also been doing research over Zoom. And in all of these contexts, we conduct experiments with young children where we structure them like fun games. And the studies are designed to assess what children think about categories, how much they endorse an essentialist view, and how that changes over age. So what I want to do next is review essentialist beliefs in children by illustrating with a few tasks that we have used and other researchers have used as well. And I put, this is the cover of my book that Cecilia mentioned. I'm putting it up here just to say there's a lot more work out there. And this book actually was summarizing research that was done a while ago. There's been much research since. So you'll just get like sort of a snippet of what the kinds of ways we measure essentialism with children are, but hopefully that will give you a sense of some of the very early tendencies that we see in children as young as 4 or 5 to think about gender in essentialist ways. Okay, so one task that we have used is to ask children to make inferences based on category labels. So for example, children would hear that this character on the top left is a boy, this character on the top right is a girl, and then they would hear that the one in the middle is a boy. And you'll notice that even though this character is a boy, he looks like the girl. What we have found is that by preschool age, children will report that anything that is taught about this boy and this girl, when asked which property is true of this boy, they will generalize from one boy to another, that the category membership reveals underlying similarities. So this boy will have the same preferences and substance in his blood and behaviors and abilities as this boy, even though he looks more like the girl. As another task, we've asked children to reason about the relative importance of nature and nurture. And as any psychologist will tell you, is it nature or is it nurture is an oversimplified question. Everything is some combination of nature and nurture. However, we can pose these puzzles to children and see where they put more weight. And so on this task, we describe a child who, as a newborn, is taken to an island with members of the other gender. So if, for example, this might be a baby boy raised on an island with only women and girls. And then children are asked, what happens when this child gets to be older, when they're 10 years old? What kinds of activities will they like? What kinds of things will they be good at, and so forth? And young children report very reliably that a boy raised on an island with only women and girls will grow up to like boy activities such as trucks and football, even though this was never modeled for him. We also find that children treat category boundaries as objectively correct. So children were shown pairs of individuals, and they were told, hey, there's a group of people from very far away who say that this and this are the same kind of person. Do you think they could be right, or are they wrong? And the two individuals vary along a number of different dimensions. When they vary by gender, young children will say, no, they could not possibly be right. There is no context in which these would be considered the same kind of person. So drawing this sharp boundary between a girl and a boy. And young children will say that boys and girls have different brains, much as the pink and blue brains that we saw examples of earlier. Now, in all of these cases, I would say that children's experiences are largely consistent with essentialist assumptions. Children are presented with a world in which boys and girls tend to have different activities and preferences, and where gender is very predictive of other features and so forth. So we were very interested in how children would think if their experiences seem to challenge essentialism. For example, what about a child like Jazz Jennings, who's in this picture, who's a transgender girl who was labeled a boy at birth? So for Jazz, gender was not stable over time, and biology was not destiny. So we were interested in whether a child like Jazz would essentialize gender. I've been collaborating on questions like this with Christina Olson at Princeton, who's in this top left picture, and Celine Gulgos at Fordham University. Dr. Olson runs what's known as a Trans Youth Project, where she's been doing a great deal of very important work looking at the development of children who are trans youth or gender nonconforming. We're interviewing children who are assigned one sex at birth, but feel from an early age that their gender doesn't match their sex at birth. We call these transgender children. And in the study, we had 97 such kids. We're also interviewing children whose gender identity and biological sex match, and we call these cisgender children. And we're interviewing a third group as well, for cisgender children or siblings of the transgender children. So we think that transgender children and their siblings are particularly important to talk with, because their lived experience runs counter to some essentialist ideas. Their lived experience contradicts the essentialist idea that gender doesn't change. It contradicts the essentialist idea that gender is rooted in biology. So these children provide an important test case for the robustness of essentialist beliefs under different experiences. We've done a variety of tasks with these children, and I'm just telling you about one study that we did. And this was that island test that I mentioned earlier. So for example, a girl named Alex is taken to an island to live with her uncles. And we explain that only boys and men lived on this island. So Alex never interacted with another girl or woman. And then after hearing this vignette, participants were asked a series of questions about Alex's future preferences. Does Alex play with dolls? Does Alex play football? And so again, as I described earlier, the child's sex at birth is pitted against their socialization environment. And again, if a child has an essentialist view of gender, they should say that sex at birth is more important than the environment. And then we had similarly a boy named Chris went to live on an island with only women and girls, and so on. So I'm going to show you the data from our three groups, where you'll see how often children made inferences based on sex at birth. So we had the cisgender group, the transgender group, and the siblings, the cisgender siblings of the transgender children. You can see here in the three panels. And each of these show changes with age for all three groups. And what you can see is that all the groups believe that a child's sex at birth would determine their later gender type preferences. So, for example, a boy raised among girls and women will grow up to show boy-typed properties. So this is showing a strong early tendency for children to rely on gender essentialism. Now, an important point here, though, is that essentialism is not just found in the US. So here's a world map, and each of these pins represents a part of the world where research teams have studied essentialism. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but it represents dozens of papers with over 7,000 participants. And what researchers have found is that both children and adults from many different societies essentialize, though which categories and to what extent varies. So when people have looked at essentialism of animals and plants, there's a very consistent tendency all over the world. People essentialize these categories. However, when people are asked about social categories, different kinds of people, the results actually vary quite a bit. Whether someone essentializes race or ethnicity or intelligence or mental illness varies depending on what the category is, who the perceiver is, and what the cultural context is. And I want to give an example of this from one study that was conducted by a former student of mine for her dissertation, Marjorie Rhodes, who is a faculty member now at NYU. And I focus on this one for two reasons. One is that it looked at gender essentialism, and the other is it looked at cultural context in an interesting way, because I saw there was a hand raised. I don't know if I'm supposed to take questions, but someone can jump in if I am. Otherwise, I'll keep talking. Thank you. So the cultural context, as I was saying, was very subtle. And you'll see why when I turn to the map of where these two cultural contexts were that Dr. Rhodes looked at in her dissertation. Okay, so this is a map of the US, and we looked at two towns in the US, a college town and one that I call small town. And you may not even see where they are on the map because it's so tiny. There they are, and you'll notice that they're right next to each other. In fact, these were two towns that were 75 miles apart, but differed in population size, in ethnic and racial diversity, in political views, education, average income. So they were in some ways the same cultural context. They're both in the US, they were both in the state of Michigan, where I am now. But in other ways, they were very different. And when we looked at essentialist beliefs, we had an essentialism task that we provided to children. What we see is same kind of pattern that we found before, high levels of gender essentialism in the youngest children, but then very different developmental patterns with age. Essentialism dipped quite a bit in the college town, did not dip in this small town. So there were no differences between the two towns for the younger ages, but there were for the older ages. So this suggests that there's something about children's experiences that can either maintain essentialism or push it down. And I'll come back to that point very soon. So just an interim summary of where we are. I've argued that essentialism is a powerful reasoning bias that emerges early in childhood, that even children with notably different gender experiences essentialize gender, and at the same time, that gender essentialism does vary substantially with cultural contexts, even seemingly subtle variations in context. So I think this naturally leads to the question, how is essentialism transmitted? Now, there are many ways this could be studied, and I'm sure that there are many factors that transmit essentialism within a culture. It's complex, of course, but I think one important place to look is language, and that's going to be my focus for the next section. So we know that human language is really distinctive in our species. It's powerful. It allows us to transmit ideas from one generation to the next and to accumulate knowledge and pass along those ideas and concepts we think are especially important for the next generation to learn. And we are the only species that has such a rich linguistic system. And this is why evolutionary biologists claim that we accept the origin of human speech as being the decisive step in the origin of specifically human society. So I think a very important question then is how language might contribute to essentialist ideas. You know, children are bathed in language from birth. We present so many ideas through language. How is this contributed? But what I was interested in is not so much those explicit messages about gender, explicitly stereotyped statements, for example, but the implicit messages. Because if you look at how language is used, there are so many implications for what we say where we don't come out and say it explicitly, but it's there as the underlying idea. So I'm going to give a few examples of this and then turn to research we've done looking at implicit essentialist messages in language. Okay, so here are some examples of the ways in which people can use language that implies something about gender above and beyond what the person explicitly says. So she is a lady doctor implies that doctors should be men. She's a great actress implies that actors should be male. Man is a rational animal implies that men represent the human species. A boss should treat his staff well implies that bosses are men. Good morning, boys and girls say a teacher says that when the children enter in the morning, implies that it's important to separate the classroom by gender. Or girls are as smart as boys implies that boys are actually smarter than girls. There's been some beautiful research on this last one by 𝘱𝘪𝘯𝘕 and 𝘱𝘪𝘯𝘕, showing that even a seemingly progressive statement by having boys as the comparison has this undermining kind of implication. Now, these are all examples from English, and it would be interesting to know to what extent there are similar statements, similar mechanisms in other languages. But my guess is that this is not just a quirk of English. The kind of language that I want to focus on is something that I will call generic language. And I will illustrate with this magazine cover. This is one actually I saw when I was shopping at the supermarket a couple of years ago, and I snapped a picture of the cover because I thought this was a perfect illustration of some of these implicit messages encoded in language. So what I want to focus on are three phrases here. The female mind, which is here, the female brain, it's a little harder to see, and how women think differently. These statements are not talking about any particular woman or even any particular group of women. They're talking about women or females generally as a category. So when we make statements or refer to the category as a whole, that is called generic language. And here's what I think the implication is. These imply that women are all alike, that they have a single type of mind or a single type of brain. There's no mention of variation or differences among women. There's no mention of time, of past, present, or future. It's just universalizing. So these are universalizing claims that gloss over individuals, they gloss over difference, and they transcend time. So we have done a number of studies where we gather and analyze conversations between parents and their young children, and looking to see to what extent parents are providing some of these implicit messages. And in fact, what we find repeatedly is that parents provide many generic statements, including about gender. One of our projects focused explicitly on how parents talk about gender. And let me give you a few examples. These are things that parents said when talking with their young children. That's not for boys. Are boys allowed to be ballet dancers? Girls aren't that much into sports. Is it because boys drive trucks? Is it because boys drive trucks that you don't want to drive one? And on and on and on. Now, these were parents who were highly educated, who reported being very much in favor of gender equality. And they often made very gender equality types of statements, but they still used many of these generics when they were talking to their children about gender. And again, as I argued before, I think these phrases imply essentialism without coming right out and saying it explicitly. And in fact, when we test for essentialism experimentally, we find that generics boost essentialism. This slide is from research by Rhodes, Leslie, and Turek, 2012. We had also examined how generics boost essentialism looking at animal categories. This study was done with human categories, so it's particularly relevant to the question of essentializing gender, which again, is a type of human category. The way the study worked is that children were assigned to one of three wording conditions, or I should just say one of three conditions. In one condition, let me step back for a second. In all three conditions, children were read a book about a new category. And the book had something like 17 pages. Each page had another fact about this new category. And so page after page, there were, different individual members of this category and a statement about something that was true of that page. So for example, here's a picture of, and the category were zarpies. Here's a picture of a zarpie eating a tulip. But what varied was whether children heard generic statements like zarpies love to eat tulips, or a non-generic statement with the same label, this zarpie loves to eat tulips, or no label at all. This loves to eat tulips. So we can tease apart these subtle variations in language. Does providing a label increase essentialism? Does going beyond just a label and providing generics, referring to that broad category, further boost essentialism? So what we found, and what Rhodes et al. Found, I'll be presenting their data with adults and with children. And what they find is that, yes, indeed, hearing a number of generic statements about this new category led the adults as well as children to assume that the category had more essentialist properties. That was higher than, for the adults, generics were higher than the specific label and were higher than no label, and a specific label led to more essentialist inferences than no label. Whereas for children, all of the effects were the generic label, the generic statements compared to the other two conditions. Okay, I want to turn to a few conclusions. And this will sort of recap what I've been saying so far. I think that essentialism is a powerful cognitive bias. Gender essentialism is particularly problematic in that it fosters stereotyping, prejudice against gender nonconforming individuals, gender imbalances in STEM, and support for gender exclusionary policies. We're also finding that generalizing language or generics encourage essentialism and are very widespread, including in conversations with young children. And I think to combat this essentialist view of gender, it's just really important to be aware of essentialist assumptions and essentialist messages. And we need to actively point out how they oversimplify gender categories. And with that, I want to thank my lab and my sponsors, and of course, all of the families who have participated in my research. And I will stop sharing my screen and hopefully take questions. I can't hear. Are you speaking? I don't hear anything. Ah, I just heard something click on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
The famous, have you tried to turn it on and off? I plug in and out.
I hope you weren't trying to talk to me during my talk, because if you were, I didn't hear a thing.
No, I'm sorry. I was just saying that I was taking the question that don't worry about the raising hands. Sorry. No.
Oh,
no.
okay. Great. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It was an amazing talk. I'm not surprised by that. So thank you. We had some questions. Sorry. One second. Ile, ¿estás compartiendo pantalla? No compartas todavía. Perdón. Sorry. We have somebody. Ahí estamos. Again, sorry. So we have some questions that I'm going to put on my glasses, because if not, I won't be able to share with you. Some of the questions, it was funny because some of the questions appear and then you answer them. So it was kind of funny, the back and forward, like, oh, what about implicit language? Oh, no, don't mind. She's answering that. So I'm going to skip those. And I'm going to go to, I don't know, first telling you something. It was also, you were like inspiring people to think about other things. And for example, Maria Leticia wanted to share with you that the case about Luana, who is the first trans girl in Argentina to obtain her rectified ID. She has a beautiful story. There is a movie called Me Girl, Me Princess.
I should look for this.
Yeah, and she also wanted to tell you that she has a twin brother. So it's also one of those cases that is also interesting, how it shows how individualities are there, right?
Right.
So just to let you know, Gabriel was wondering about sexism and how this heteronormative kind of behavior influence essentialism, if there is some kind of a study about how sexism influence on essentialism.
Oh, that's really interesting, because I've thought about, well, of course, in much of the research, there's a correlation, say, between, sexism and essentialism. And we don't know for sure what the direction of influence is. And I had been thinking about essentialism, since it's such an early developing bias that's in place at such a young age. I was thinking of that as sort of contributing to sexism. And just as an aside, there's some very interesting work by André Simpian and his colleagues looking at very young children, and he and his collaborators have been finding a change from 5 to 6 years of age. Now we know 5-year-olds are already gender essentialist, but having sexist views about women or girls not being like as smart in math kind of thing, that seems to increase somewhere between 5 and 6, which is suggesting that there's some interaction with their, maybe with schooling or maybe with their environment, that's causing essentialism to translate into these sorts of sexist beliefs. But let me think about the reverse question. I could see, I'm sort of speculating here. There may be research on this. I must say there is, what's interesting to me about essentialism, in addition to everything that I talked about, is that it's been examined from like different disciplinary perspectives. And so I'm very aware of like the developmental psychology research on essentialism. There's also a vast social psychology literature on essentialism. I'm certainly aware of some of that work, but not all of it. So my caveat is that this may have been studied, but I'll speculate anyway.
Okay.
I think that you know, if you look at sort of how stereotype and sexist beliefs are communicated, it often is, I think, in this absolute way that that goes hand in hand with essentialism. There was this very famous example, I don't know, maybe about 15 years ago, where the president of Harvard University at the time, Lawrence Summers, was making remarks at a women's conference, and he just offhand said, hey, you know, the reason we're finding, it's a shame that there aren't more women at Harvard who are in the STEM fields, who are, you know, professors, but, you know, women just really don't want to be in the STEM fields. They don't want to spend that much time doing science. They would rather spend time with their families. And, you know, my granddaughters love to play with dolls. And if I give them a truck, they're not even interested in it. So it's just, that's just the way they are. So it's like very sexist beliefs. It was very offensive. People walked out of that talk. He ended up shortly thereafter leaving the presidency of that university. But I was struck by how many essentialist assumptions were sort of built into that. So what's interesting as well is sometimes on the surface, something may look not too terrible or sexist, like somebody like I think he thought he was being progressive because he was saying, oh, you know, just, it's not that women can't do it, it's that they're not interested. And he thought that was like softening it. But really, if you think about what he was saying, it's, well, he thought they weren't interested because he thought that's inherent and inborn and just the way women are. So it goes back to essentialism, even if you want to say, yeah, the ability is there. So maybe what I'm getting back to is that I think these get very intertwined. So I think it's a great question. And my guess is that these are mutually supporting belief systems.
Yes, yeah. And I always go to that conference to talk like, okay, somebody can have very good intentions or not, but we could at least say we don't know, and it goes really wrong really fast.
Right, right, exactly.
Yes, and I think that during your comments, you were like answering some of the questions that appear. So I'm going to jump to some questions. And given that it's 12, I'm going to go to a last one. There were many of the questions talk about how this can change, right, through time, yes. How essentialism can change, what can modify that. And I'm going to put all of those questions together and add one more thing, given that that many of the participants are from the education community and are teachers. Should we teach about essentialism about school? Should we teach the teachers about essentialisms? Because it is there, right? There's something that can be done. What do you think?
I think we should, as long as it's done in contrast to the, you know, the alternative. I think if we just say, okay, here are people's beliefs, there is the danger that it just feels so intuitively right to many people that it could potentially just reinforce essentialist beliefs. So I think like really being sure to contrast it, like, you know, the variety and diversity within each gender and the overlap between the genders and the importance of structural factors and the importance of you know, environmental factors and change over time. I'm actually very excited about a project that is, there's a project I'm on the advisory board for that's examining genetic essentialism, belief that gender differences are due to genetic differences between men and women. And they are developing an intervention that would be school-based to teach about, differences, problems with essentialist views of gender. The person leading this is Brian Donovan in the US. And so I think it can be done, but I don't think it's easy. And I think it needs to be thought through very carefully to avoid inadvertently, sort of persisting the kinds of essentialist beliefs that we're trying to move people away from.
Yeah, yeah, not to do some harm, also with trying to do something good.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you just two more things, and I know that I'm leaving out a lot of questions. I'm sorry. I promise I will send these questions to Susan, and we will have to invite her once again. One is some people was asking about your book. Is it only in English? Is available in Spanish?
I don't know. Think it's ever been translated, unfortunately. Okay. I wish it had.
Okay, no. I wasn't sure. I haven't come across, but I was just checking. Okay, and just to finish, I would like to just, what is your take-home message? Like what, if you want us to remember something about this talk, what do you think is like your final remarks?
My final remark is be aware of essentialist biases and confront them and contradict them whenever possible.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm so excited. I don't know if you can tell. I will keep talking to you for hours, but I would like to be very neat with the timetable. So thank you very much once again. If you want to stay, you're more than welcome here at Zoom. And now we are going to move to the next talk, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
So, voy a cambiar de nuevo de idioma. Para los que están en el audio original, primero voy a volver a decir ahora en español, lamento que quedaron preguntas afuera, había un montón, lo siento, traté de juntarlas todas lo más posible, pero queremos ser lo más prolijos con el horario para las charlistas y también para ustedes, así que voy a invitar a nuestra próxima speaker, a Gabriela. Hola Gaby, ¿cómo estás?
Hola, ¿cómo están? Acá estoy.
¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo estás?
Apareciste.
Muchas gracias por sumarte. Lo dije al principio y lo vuelvo a decir ahora, tuve el placer de que los 3 mails de invitación que uno manda como al principio, bien arriba, diciendo, bueno, espero que esta gente me diga que sí, las 3 me dijeron que sí, Gaby fue una de ellas, así que muchas gracias. Les cuento también, para quienes no la conozcan, me pongo más seria y dejo de decirle Gaby, digo la doctora Gabriela Zunino, es licenciada en letras, es licenciada y doctora en lingüística por la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Ella es profesora de grado, profesora de posgrado en las facultades de Psicología, de Filosofía y Letras de Buenos Aires y de la Universidad de 𝘍𝘭𝘏. La doctora Zunino es investigadora del CONICET y dirige y codirige tesistas y proyectos de investigación en el ámbito de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la UBA. También dirige la revista, espero pronunciar bien, 𝘍𝘭𝘶𝘦, que es una revista de lingüística de la Facultad de Lenguas de 𝘍𝘭𝘶𝘦. Y dentro de los estudios que realiza, o sus estudios de investigación sobre cognición y procesamiento del lenguaje, Gabriela está especialmente interesada en los estudios o que tienen relación interdisciplinaria que vinculan la lingüística teórica con la filosofía de la mente, con la psicolingüística, con la educación, como para que vean este marco interdisciplinario que ella usa y en donde desarrolla sus investigaciones, y hace algunos años, dentro de las cosas que ella hace, incluye una línea de investigación, que ya no diría nueva, que está vinculada con el análisis del procesamiento de formas morfológicas no binarias en español, y su relación con la manipulación cognitiva de las representaciones mentales sostenidas sobre estereotipos de género. Por eso nos pareció que era trascendental traerla para tener también una voz nacional, una voz de la investigación que estamos haciendo acá, en un tema que es tan candente y que espero que nos tensione, que espero que nos interpele, así que a ese respecto nos va a estar hablando en su charla que se titula Inclusive el lenguaje, tensiones en torno a la expresión de género de las lenguas. Muchas gracias de nuevo, Gaby, me callo y te dejo toda la sala para vos.
Bueno, soy Gaby, de hecho yo me cambié a Gabriela Zunino acá en el Zoom, pero tengo Gaby Zunino normalmente puesto, o sea, es así, esto ya está. Y me suena rarísimo que me digan Gabriela, así que me pueden decir Gaby, sin problema. Bueno, espero que me escuchen bien. Primero quería agradecerle a Ceci, a la doctora Calero, esta invitación. La verdad que es un honor para mí. Además estoy, digamos, me siento como el sueño de la piba, porque me formé con Susan, o sea, hay una cantidad de cosas de admiración entre las personas que me acompañan hoy en esta mesa, y creo que por lo que venía escuchando de Susan, muchas cosas van a ver que las voy a retomar. Incluso hay estudios interesantes vinculados con si el uso del lenguaje inclusivo, el fomento del lenguaje inclusivo en niñez, justamente ayuda a desarmar un poco esta estabilización tan temprana de los estereotipos de género, por lo cual creo que van a ver bastante vínculo entre la presentación de Susan y la que les voy a hacer yo. En principio les voy a compartir la presentación. ¿Puedo yo? ¿Ya estoy habilitada para compartir?
A ver, y le podemos darle permiso para compartir a... Ahí está, listo, ahora sí podés.
Genial. Ahí vamos.
Estas son las cosas que pasan, que uno chequea todo y después en el momento...
Sí, pero puede ocurrir.
Así
puede
que
fallar.
si la cámara nos acompaña, ahí
Bien.
se ve perfecto.
Genial. Bueno, entonces ahí arranco, ¿sí? La idea un poco es hacer un recorrido en 4 grandes partes. Yo tengo una tasa de habla alta, y cuando me entusiasmo es peor todavía, o sea que si voy muy rápido alguien me frena, me levanta la manito y enlentezco. Pero porque además, digamos, no quiero dejar nada fuera, y les quería hacer un panorama más o menos acabado de las discusiones que están teniendo lugar en lingüística, acá y en el mundo, ¿sí? Para mostrar un poco también que no es una moda local y reciente, ¿no? Como decía Ceci, no es algo nuevo, y hay algunos argumentos que uno escucha que es, bueno, ahora se les ocurre esto. Bueno, para mostrar que no, estas discusiones vienen de larga data. En principio, 2 grandes bloques por los que voy a pasar más o menos rápido, que son específicamente lingüísticos, para que tengan un panorama de cuáles son las posibilidades de representación de género, y en las que el género aparece sesgando o de alguna forma en las lenguas. ¿Qué características tiene particularmente el género gramatical en español, que es una lengua, ya les adelanto, con género gramatical, es decir, tiene algunas características puntuales que a veces también hacen más tensas las propuestas de lenguaje inclusivo de género, porque el español marca con género muchas más palabras que lo hacen otras lenguas. Y después sí me voy a enfocar en otros 2 grandes bloques que tienen más que ver con cognición, procesamiento del lenguaje y vínculos con las representaciones mentales sostenidas por estereotipos de género. En principio, un gran bloque de estudios también en otras lenguas distintas al español, que muestran evidencia respecto de los posibles condicionamientos mutuos que establecen las formas lingüísticas con los estereotipos de género, y digo mutuo porque es una, digamos, moneda con dos caras, como todas las monedas, y entonces hay estudios que tratan de evidenciar de qué manera las formas lingüísticas utilizadas pueden de alguna manera sesgar o condicionar las representaciones de género que construimos, y viceversa, los estereotipos de género establecidos, estabilizados de manera consistente como parte de nuestro conocimiento sobre el mundo, también inciden a la hora de comprender lenguaje. Y por último, sí ya focalizarme en cuáles son las propuestas más habituales que se ven en el mundo de lenguaje inclusivo de género. Algunas de ellas son las formas no binarias, pero no son las únicas, y sí después focalizarme en el caso del español de América Latina, sobre el cual tenemos algunos datos empíricos de nuestros estudios en psicolingüística acá en el país, y algunas colaboraciones con Chile, en donde se puede ver también cosas interesantes en relación con cómo varía relativo a la comunidad lingüística, no estrictamente a la lengua. Bien, entonces, para iniciar y dar un gran marco, digamos, a esta charla, lo que me gustaría es decir que las múltiples formas en las que el género y el lenguaje se vinculan no se restringen solamente a la codificación morfológica o léxica. ¿Sí? Hay un plano discursivo más abstracto en el que, por supuesto, no podemos perder de vista que las relaciones discursivas construyen y son construidas por relaciones de poder, ¿sí? Entonces, en ese gran marco de las relaciones de poder, es que también tenemos que entender todas las discusiones que vinculan género y lenguaje. No queremos el foco en la morfología, es solo uno de los posibles modos de abordar el fenómeno amplio, ¿sí? De ninguna manera podemos restringirlo a eso. Y tampoco podemos quedarnos tranquiles diciendo, bueno, si hablamos en inclusivo ya está, todos los problemas respecto de los sesgos de género en el discurso están resueltos. Piensen, por ejemplo, yo doy este ejemplo porque es bastante gráfico, una frase como, mi mujer me reventó la tarjeta, dicha en un grupo de WhatsApp de varones que van a jugar al fútbol. Ahí no hay inclusivo que valga, y sin embargo la carga respecto del estereotipo de género asignado a las mujeres y a su conducta, en ese fragmento de discurso es fuertísima, ¿sí? Entonces, eso tampoco lo resolvemos solo con aplicar formas no binarias a las palabras, en este caso. Entonces, dicho eso, vamos a ir un poco de lo general a lo particular, y el próximo elemento que yo les quería marcar es donde, digamos, empezamos sí a ver marcas efectivamente codificadas en las formas lingüísticas, no ya discursivas, que pueden empezar a establecer o a generar ciertos sesgos de género a través de la lengua, porque como decía Susan, la lengua es ubicua, está en todos lados, la usamos todos, por suerte, además, y los usos lingüísticos son intrínsecamente variables, ¿sí? Entonces ahí hay que poder detectar cuáles son las variaciones de esos usos que efectivamente pueden estar implicando algún sesgo de género. Obviamente todos conocemos la idea del falso genérico, utilizado en singular, no en plural. En plural me voy a referir al uso del masculino genérico en plural más adelante, pero el ejemplo de el hombre es un ser vivo, entendido como, Susan dio ese ejemplo, en inglés, efectivamente, como ella decía, y su sospecha era cierta, en otras lenguas funciona de la misma manera, es tomado, digamos, como el metro patrón, el masculino para todas las personas, los seres vivientes humanos, digamos, es restringido a el hombre. Pero hay un elemento interesante, un fenómeno interesante que a mí me gusta en general destacar, que es el de los duales aparentes, ¿sí? Se llaman duales aparentes porque justamente son pares heteronímicos, digamos, que en general se llaman pares heterónimos, cuando uno tiene una misma palabra que flexiona en masculino y en femenino, zorro, zorra, puto, puta, etc., que tienen connotaciones totalmente diferentes vinculadas con el femenino y el masculino. En el caso de flexionar en femenino, generan una connotación de estereotipos femeninos en general absolutamente denigrantes para las mujeres, sobre todo enfocados en la sexualidad femenina, que no tiene el masculino. Entonces, ese desequilibrio enorme nos muestra que la marca de género no solo está funcionando como una mera marca de género inocua, no está marcando el femenino de la idea de zorro, ¿sí? Está agregándole otros sentidos solo cuando se trata del femenino. Entonces, en esas cosas que a veces pasan inadvertidas, empiezan a filtrarse de manera implícita, como decía también Susan, algunos elementos que después van a pesar en la construcción de esos estereotipos y en los discursos que circulan y están habilitados para mujeres y para varones de manera distinta, ¿sí? Bien, ahora sí, para empezar a restringir el foco, les muestro un panorama general, ¿sí?, de los distintos paradigmas de género en la gramática en las distintas lenguas. No sé si ustedes saben, pero el género no se marca igual en todas las lenguas tienen distintos paradigmas de género. Algunas incluso tienen género gramatical, pero no tienen paradigmas binarios de género gramatical, ¿sí? Es decir, hay que desacoplar eso. La idea de que las lenguas tengan género gramatical no necesariamente implica que sean binarias. El español tiene un género gramatical binario, pero el alemán no, ¿sí? Para dar un ejemplo. Y también hay lenguas que no pertenecen al bloque de lenguas con género gramatical, como es el caso del inglés, que en general se llaman lenguas con género natural. Una distinción sencilla y clave es que las lenguas con género gramatical se dice que tienen género inherente. Estamos obligados, ¿sí?, a codificar el género en todos los sustantivos, y eso además tracciona la necesidad de concordar al sustantivo con las palabras que, vamos a decir, lo rodean, en este caso determinantes o artículos o adjetivos, por ejemplo, con ese mismo género gramatical, ¿sí? Pero no hay sustantivos sin género gramatical en español, tanto para objetos animados como para objetos inanimados como para entidades animadas, ¿sí? Y ahí se abre, y yo después me voy a referir un poquito más en detalle a esto, toda una discusión en torno a si el proceso de asignación de género en lenguas con género gramatical es totalmente arbitrario o si tiene alguna motivación, especialmente en el caso en el que esas palabras refieran a personas, ¿sí?, y no refieran a objetos o a entidades inanimadas. Pero esa es la gran distinción entre estos dos bloques. En un caso se marcan todos los sustantivos y los pronombres, y en el otro caso solo los pronombres, cuando refieren a personas, tienen la marca de género, ¿sí? Entonces, eso proyecta diferencias también a la hora de pensar propuestas de lenguaje inclusivo, como se podrán imaginar. Otros dos grandes bloques de lenguas son aquellas que combinan género gramatical con género natural, ¿sí?, que algunos sustantivos marcan género, otros no marcan género, incluso algunos que refieren a personas no marcan género, como tenemos en español algunos casos que son llamados sustantivos epicenos. Es decir, fluctúa, no hay una situación tan sistemática. Y hay otras lenguas que ni siquiera marcan género en ninguna de las palabras, ¿sí?, que por ahí marcan otros rasgos semánticos, como por ejemplo la característica de animado e inanimado, pero no tienen marca de género. Entonces, todas esas posibilidades existen. Y esto lo digo para pensar que no todo es como creemos que es el español, ni todo es tan fijo ni inamovible, y las cosas pueden cambiar. De hecho, el español, es una lengua romance, el latín tenía 3 géneros, no 2. Entonces, esas cosas pueden modificarse, no hay que rasgarse las vestiduras en torno a esos problemas. Para decir básicamente 3 cosas claves de que hay que saber del género gramatical en español para entender algunas de las discusiones en torno al fenómeno del lenguaje inclusivo de género, yo diría que quiero destacar estas 3. Una, su condición de paradigma binario, o sea, no solo género gramatical, es decir, género inherente para los sustantivos, sino que además tiene una estructura de paradigma binario. Hay estudios, se los voy a mencionar, que marcan que en las lenguas con paradigmas binarios hay una tendencia muy fuerte a proyectar, y esto se vincula con la idea de esencialismo que marcaba Susan, a proyectar de manera lineal el género gramatical al sexo biológico. Incluso una tendencia fuerte que nos lleva hasta a proyectarlo a entidades inanimadas, es decir, hacer una suerte de personificación de los objetos a partir de esa proyección, ¿sí? Por otro lado está el gran problema que les mencionaba antes en relación con la arbitrariedad o motivación de la asignación de género. Está claro que la mesa, el inodoro, el horno, están asignados arbitrariamente. Sin embargo, hay muchos estudios desde la sociolingüística, desde la pragmática, que marcan que la asignación de género para sustantivos que refieren a personas, sobre todo, algunos lo amplían a entidades animadas, a todos los animales, por ejemplo, pero vamos a referirnos a personas. No sería tan arbitrario, ¿sí? También estaría condicionado por factores sociales, pragmáticos, es decir, no sería un proceso tan sencillo de arbitrariedad y podría tener algún rasgo de motivación. Y por último, el gran otro problema que salta a partir del fenómeno del lenguaje inclusivo de género y del uso de las formas no binarias, es esta idea de hasta qué punto el masculino genérico funciona, tal como las gramáticas tradicionales del español nos dice que funciona, es representando grupos de personas, por ejemplo, usado con sintagmas en plural, de género no uniforme, ¿sí? Y ese masculino genérico deriva de un eje típicamente lingüístico gramatical de los estudios gramaticales, que es considerar que el masculino es la forma no marcada, o la que se utiliza por defecto en esta lengua para marcar cualquier cosa que no quiera distinguir específicamente. Y en cambio el femenino es la forma marcada, es decir, si tengo que destacar que algo es femenino, le agrego algo, y si no, por defecto considero que es masculino, ¿sí? De ahí deriva la idea de que el masculino se puede usar como genérico. Yo les dejo acá, simplemente para que tengan una idea, por todos estos motivos en general se define que el masculino es la forma no marcada en español y puede eventualmente ser usado como genérico. Piensen, por ejemplo, que esta idea de por defecto se ve cuando uno quiere sustantivar una palabra que no es un sustantivo. Piensen en los verbos que usamos como el caminar. Usamos el masculino como base para definir o sustantivar la acción de caminar. O, si yo digo, el pero de tal lado, usando pero como una forma lingüística, lo sustantivo en masculino, ¿sí? Esos elementos son los que en general muestran que el masculino funciona como un no marcado en español. Para que tengan un breve panorama de cómo se estructura el paradigma de género en español, que no es sencillo, que no es lineal, lo que se puede ver es que tenemos lo que se llaman pares heterónimos, ¿sí? Es decir, parejas de palabras que cuando se refieren a entidades animadas y específicamente a personas tienen dos formas, una que refiere a varones y una que refiere a mujeres, que puede ser marcada o en la raíz o en la desinencia, ya sea en la morfología derivativa o en la flexiva, que es la que típicamente se toca cuando hablamos del lenguaje inclusivo de género en español con la famosa E, ¿sí? Esta idea de maestro, maestro, maestre, o alumno, alumna, alumne, ¿sí? Pero también hay formas de sustantivos sin marca de género que son llamados epicenos, ¿sí? Por ejemplo, persona, colega. Recién hablaba con Verónica en relación con que muchas veces adoptamos esta forma justamente para intentar eliminar marcas de género en lugares que, por ejemplo, no permiten el uso de inclusivo. Y por otro lado está el uso de sustantivos colectivos, como la humanidad, el alumnado, que tienen, ¿sí? un género gramatical, pero que refieren intrínsecamente por el concepto mismo a entidades que en principio no marcan género. Lo traigo porque muchas de las estrategias de lenguaje inclusivo que van a ver, que incluso se aceptan con mayor frecuencia en los manuales, en las hojas de estilo, son estas dos últimas, ¿sí? O sea, para evitar las innovaciones, tienden a fomentar el uso de epicenos y de colectivos. Bien, dicho esto, lo que entonces voy a hacer ahora es empezar a adentrarme un poco en si existen y cuáles son las evidencias que tenemos de que las formas lingüísticas que utilizamos pueden incidir de alguna manera en las representaciones mentales, ¿sí?, que construimos respecto del género, y viceversa, de qué manera esos estereotipos construidos y estabilizados pueden incidir en la interpretación que hacemos de piezas de discurso. Entonces, yo acá marco tres preguntas básicas, ¿sí? Uno, ¿cómo es posible relacionar un paradigma de género, por ejemplo, un paradigma de género gramatical como el que tenemos en español, con estereotipos de género que manejamos? La otra gran pregunta que aparece mucho entre lingüistas, ¿sí?, y es el fantasma del determinismo lingüístico. Entonces vos me querés decir que según la lengua que hablo, es que tengo un estereotipo de género o en el otro, y entonces cambiar la forma lingüística automáticamente va a cambiar y derribar nuestros estereotipos de género. De ninguna manera nadie está postulando eso, y como decía antes, al principio, el fenómeno de la relación entre género y lenguaje es muy complejo. Lejos estaríamos de creer que solo a partir de la atracción que puede hacer la morfología con una nueva forma, vamos a derribar el patriarcado. De ninguna manera decimos eso, y en la lingüística ya tampoco se acepta en general el determinismo lingüístico, pero lo que sí existe es una gran cantidad de evidencia que lo que marca es que hay cierto condicionamiento, que hay cierto sesgo, que las formas lingüísticas que utilizamos pueden, por ejemplo, focalizar nuestra atención sobre determinados rasgos del significado y desatender otras. Entonces, eso sí genera alguna incidencia, no lo determina, pero lo condiciona de alguna manera. Y por el otro lado, entonces, está esta idea de cómo podemos encontrar evidencia empírica de ese tipo de vínculos. Uno de los fenómenos más estudiados en las distintas lenguas es esta idea de que el masculino genérico funcione como genérico o que falle en tener esa función que las gramáticas le adjudican, que es el genérico efectivamente logra representar personas de género no uniforme en un grupo. No te preocupes, porque los hablantes de la lengua saben que eso es así. Es decir, es totalmente inocuo. Es uno de los argumentos para resistir, en todo caso, la aplicación de innovaciones morfológicas. Si con el masculino genérico alcanza, porque las personas ya saben cómo interpretar eso. Bien, al final vamos a ver que parece que no alcanza tanto. Y una cosa interesante es que en todas las lenguas se encuentran sistemáticamente que el masculino genérico falla para generar representaciones genéricas, que tiene lo que se llama un sesgo masculinizante. Es decir, hay una tendencia mucho mayor a interpretarlo como grupos de varones y no como grupos de, y voy a decir por ahora, mixtos. Ni siquiera estamos entrando en otras identidades sexogenéricas, ¿sí? Que no estén dentro del paradigma binario. Un estudio que yo les quería comentar es un estudio que se hizo en Alemania en español, y fíjense la fecha, y por esto digo que esto no es reciente, no se está estudiando recién desde ahora, y las potenciales proyecciones de las formas lingüísticas en las representaciones de género es un tema que viene de larga data. Lo que hace Konishi en este estudio es preguntarse si efectivamente en las lenguas con género gramatical, y por eso toma alemán y español, que son dos lenguas que tienen género gramatical, el género asignado a un nombre, en este caso a entidades inanimadas, conlleva alguna connotación vinculada con la masculinidad y la feminidad de las personas, ¿sí? Y entonces su hipótesis es que sí, porque implica cierta personificación de la entidad. Y lo que hace es evaluar pares que en las dos lenguas estén cruzados en su asignación de género gramatical. Para el español sol es masculino y luna es femenino, y para el alemán es al revés. Entonces lo que hace es pedirle a los hablantes que describan con rasgos esas dos entidades. Y lo que encuentran, efectivamente, es que el género gramatical que tiene esa palabra en esa lengua genera una proyección de otorgarle rasgos femeninos cuando luna es femenino y masculinos cuando luna es masculino a esa entidad inanimada, ¿sí? Entonces, hablantes de español describen al sol con rasgos estereotípicamente masculinos, fuerte, denso, no sé qué, y la luna etérea, débil, sutil, con rasgos que estereotípicamente se vinculan con las mujeres, esencialistamente, como decía Susan, con varones y mujeres. Pero en alemán los describen inversos. Entonces, ahí lo que Konishi dice es evidente que la marca de género gramatical en esas dos palabras está traccionando algo vinculado con su proyección al sexo biológico, ¿sí?
Gaby, te interrumpo un segundo.
Sí.
Me están pidiendo que hables un poquitito más lento en el chat.
Ahí vamos. Yo no estoy viendo.
No, lo estoy mirando yo, por eso te interrumpí.
Perfecto.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias. ¿Vieron qué iba a pasar? El que avisa no traiciona, la que avisa no traiciona. Bien. El otro estudio que más o menos les quería mostrar tiene que ver, ¿por qué lo traigo? Porque es un estudio que lo que hace es analizar este fenómeno en el contexto de una hipótesis de relación entre pensamiento y lenguaje, entre representaciones mentales y formas lingüísticas, que se llama Thinking for Speaking, o pensar para hablar, ¿sí? en la traducción en español. Y es una hipótesis que lo que dice, o lo que plantea, es esto que yo les decía antes. No hay una determinación de las formas lingüísticas sobre el pensamiento, sobre los conceptos, sobre las representaciones mentales, pero sí hay un sesgo en los términos en los que algunas lenguas focalizan la atención de sus hablantes sobre ciertos rasgos del significado. En el caso de las lenguas con género gramatical, lo focalizamos sobre el género como rasgo semántico relevante para las palabras, ¿sí? Y eso puede eventualmente tener proyecciones hacia la cognición en general. Y entonces lo que encuentran 𝘍𝘭𝘶𝘧 y su equipo es justamente que cuando existe mediación lingüística, es decir, cuando verbalizamos, por ejemplo, pensamientos, existe un efecto del género gramatical sobre la representación semántica manipulada, que además hay variaciones en función del paradigma de género de cada lengua, es decir, las personas que hablan lenguas con un paradigma de género tienen efectos distintos a las que hablan lenguas con otro paradigma de género, y que además las lenguas con paradigma de género binario específicamente, tienden a hacer esa proyección lineal que yo les decía antes entre género gramatical y sexo biológico, asumiendo el paradigma de identidades sexogenéricas de manera casi esencialista, solo en dos, ¿sí? Pero para que tengan una idea, en los últimos 5 o 6 años, diría, hubo una explosión en todas las lenguas, en general lenguas europeas, hay que decirlo, de estudios psicolingüísticos de procesamiento en relación con estereotipos de género, vínculos entre género y lenguaje, y formas, digamos, nuevas, inclusivas de género, y como ven, hay en una cantidad diversa de lenguas, con paradigmas de género distintas, y además con técnicas experimentales muy distintas. Hay estudios conductuales, es decir, por ejemplo, miden procesos mentales a través de tiempos de reacción, pero también hay estudios con técnicas electrofisiológicas que muestran los correlatos neurales de esos procesos mentales, por lo cual la evidencia, y como decía Ceci al principio, es cada vez más robusta en torno a este fenómeno. No solo son hipótesis teóricas, empezamos a tener evidencia empírica de respaldo para algunas de esas hipótesis teóricas. Bien, pero como yo les decía, la moneda tiene dos caras, y entonces también hay estudios que muestran cuáles son las proyecciones, ¿sí?, de los estereotipos de género durante el procesamiento del lenguaje. Es decir, de qué forma inciden los estereotipos de género que yo ya tengo construidos como parte de mi conocimiento sobre el mundo a la hora de interpretar una oración, un texto. Una cosa interesante que marcan estos autores, y hay algún par de trabajos más que lo indican, es que los estereotipos de género, si bien son parte de nuestro bagaje llamado conocimiento sobre el mundo, tienen un estatus de una naturaleza diferente, porque de hecho se consolidan muy tempranamente, que es un poco también de lo que hablaba Susan, ¿sí? Niñas muy pequeñas se ve que tienen consolidados entre los 2 y los 5 años muchos de los rasgos de los estereotipos de género tradicionales. Y hay algo interesante en un estudio que les voy a también mostrar, que se ve que son menos flexibles, es decir, que se agarran muchísimo más a los estereotipos de género para comprender determinadas conductas o para interpretar textos que asignan conductas a determinados personajes según el género que se le asigna, ¿sí? Entonces, también es interesante para pensarlo desde el ámbito educativo esto. O sea, y muchos dicen, bueno, la lengua, justamente también como decía Susan, y el fomento de algunas formas inclusivas de lenguaje pueden ser buenas herramientas para desistematizar un poco esa conformación tan temprana de estereotipos férreos en niñas, ¿sí? O sea, es una buena estrategia para empezar a mover un poco el avispero y que no todo esté tan dicotomizado en dos, ¿sí? Solo en dos formas de entender la identidad de género. Lo otro que encuentran con bastante, digamos, sistematicidad son efectos de congruencia e incongruencia relacionados con estereotipos de género y marcas codificadas, marcas gramaticales codificadas en las palabras, es decir, las palabras que tienen pragmáticamente un estereotipo de género vinculado con varones y están marcadas con masculinos son más fáciles de procesar porque son congruentes, y las que son incongruentes en términos de que no coincide el estereotipo con la marca gramatical son más complejas. Y por otro lado, lo que muestran es un efecto muy temprano en el decurso temporal del procesamiento, muy temprano en los estereotipos. No es que los usamos al final para revisar, no. Aparecen, inciden de manera casi automática cuando estamos interpretando textos, ¿sí? Entonces, también están muy fuera de nuestro control consciente muchas veces, lo cual alerta, porque entonces, ni aunque nos demos cuenta, estamos sí haciendo incidir esas ideas previas cuando interpretamos lenguaje. Este es el estudio que yo les decía, que si a alguno le interesa, se los puedo pasar. Es un estudio interesante que lo que hace es ver cómo es, porque hay una discusión en relación con si las personas mayores son menos flexibles y están más fijadas al estereotipo de género, los menores, y lo que encuentran acá es que en realidad las niñas están mucho más sostenidas por estereotipo de género que los adultos mayores, ¿sí? Y lo que hacen es presentar pares, ¿sí?, de palabras, por ejemplo, como los que tienen ahí, trabajadora social y mamá, es decir, una palabra que asigna un rol laboral estereotípicamente vinculado con una mujer, y una palabra que tiene léxicamente codificada la marca de género como mamá, y jefe de área y papá, ¿sí? Las dos cosas del masculino. Y lo que preguntan es si estas dos palabras podrían referir a la misma persona, ¿sí? Lo que encuentran es que hay una activación temprana y muy rápida de los estereotipos, que las niñas se agarran mucho más de estereotipos que les adultes, pero además un dato interesante es que encuentran una asimetría en la asociación. Son mucho mejor tolerados los pares incongruentes que tienen un rol laboral típicamente femenino asignado a un varón, es decir, enfermero papá, que los pares que tienen un rol laboral estereotípicamente masculino asignado a una mujer, jefa de área, mamá, ¿sí? Nuevamente un desequilibrio implícito que nos marca lo mucho que operan los estereotipos de género a la hora de interpretar lenguaje. Bien, entonces, ahí sí, y a esto quería llegar, con este panorama, podemos empezar a pensar un poco cuáles son, ¿sí?, las estrategias de lenguaje inclusivo de género en las distintas lenguas y cuáles pueden ser eventualmente los efectos durante el procesamiento del uso de esas estrategias inclusivas, específicamente de las innovaciones morfológicas. Para que ustedes tengan un panorama, hay tres grandes grupos de propuestas en este momento en el mundo. Unas son las que podemos denominar como feminización, porque en realidad lo que hacen es visibilizar a las mujeres en los pares, ¿sí? Por eso algunos le llaman duplicación, ¿sí? Es decir, marcamos dentro del paradigma binario las, él, ella, y entonces duplicamos todo, pero no tocamos el paradigma binario, ¿sí? Es simplemente una visibilización de que, como mínimo, hay mujeres y varones. Luego está la estrategia de neutralización, o que se llama en general neutralización, que es lo que yo les decía antes, este fomento del uso de sustantivos epicenos, de colectivos, o de estructuras sintácticas que lo que hacen es borrar la marca gramatical de género, y por eso, en principio, podrían ser entendidos como neutros. ¿Y por qué lo pongo entre muchas comillas neutro? Porque como dijimos, los nombres cargan con estereotipos vinculados pragmáticamente a esas palabras. Entonces, por más que neutralicemos la marca gramatical, muchas veces no neutralizamos el estereotipo pragmático que viene asociado. Entonces la neutralización es solo aparente, ¿sí? Por último, tenemos las propuestas de innovaciones. Y en esas propuestas de innovaciones hay básicamente tres niveles en los que podemos por ahora, o los que hemos propuesto por ahora innovar. Léxico, es decir, la innovación de palabras completas, pronombres, en muchos casos, en el sueco, por ejemplo, un nuevo pronombre no binario, la refuncionalización de pronombres que existen como hace el inglés, que utiliza el they singular, o la creación de neologismos como police person para evitar policeman, ¿sí? Pero también tenemos innovaciones morfológicas, que es el caso del lenguaje no binario de género en español con la letra E, con el morfema E, y algunas otras de tipo ortográfico o meramente gráficas, que no tienen proyección a la lengua hablada, ¿sí? Esa es una gran distinción en general entre los usos de E y los usos de X en el español, ¿sí? La X no tiene, ¿sí?, pronunciación, y la E sí tiene pronunciación, entonces se puede proyectar a todos los usos de la lengua. El portugués también usa en general esas dos formas, y hay un fenómeno interesante ahora bastante difundido, que es el que se llama asterisco generizado del alemán, que en principio parecía una marca léxica, una marca ortográfica nada más, pero tiene asociado una forma de pronunciación. Entonces, también funciona para la lengua hablada. Y dicho esto, una cosa interesante para notar es que los argumentos de resistencia a las propuestas de lenguaje inclusivo suelen ser comunes y consistentes en las distintas comunidades lingüísticas, más allá de en qué lugar del mundo estén, de qué tipo de lengua sean, de qué tipo de paradigma de género gramatical tengan. En general, se dividen en estos dos grandes grupos. Uno que es el normativismo y el conservadurismo lingüístico, esta idea de que la gramática no se puede manejar, que esto es romper el idioma, etc. Y el otro se vincula con lo que mencionaba Susan antes, con un fuerte sesgo esencialista en la concepción de las identidades sexogenéricas, en donde hay una idea de que esencialmente somos varones y mujeres y no puede haber nada más, y que además los rasgos sexuales visibles, perceptibles, nos permiten conocer la identidad genérica de una persona sin ningún lugar a dudas, ¿sí? Estos son los que surgen en general en casi todas las comunidades en donde se ha analizado esto. Para que ustedes tengan un resumen, lo que, digamos, podemos decir es que, en general, encuentran que el uso de, como yo les decía antes, que el uso del masculino genérico no es tal, no funciona como genérico, que la feminización, la duplicación sí sirve para visibilizar mujeres en grupos mixtos, pero que queda restringido todo al binarismo todavía, que las estrategias inclusivas, y esto es interesante, funcionan mucho mejor cuando referimos a grupos, es decir, cuando reemplazamos el uso genérico, que cuando las usamos para referir a una persona individual que se autopercibe fuera del paradigma binario de género, y que por último las innovaciones son las únicas que logran romper la fijeza del paradigma binario tradicional, que las otras solo reproducen el binarismo de género. Y por eso es que nosotros con el equipo tratamos de hablar de formas no binarias, porque nos parece que ahí justamente está el clic en el que nos permitimos pensar en otredades que no están dentro del binarismo de género propio de un esencialismo meramente biológico. Entonces, ¿tenemos datos en español? Es la gran pregunta, porque, como sabemos, aparecen todo el tiempo este tipo de afirmaciones categóricas en el aire de esto funciona así, no me molestes, esto es muy complicado, seguramente las personas no saben a qué se refiere, entonces complica el procesamiento, la gente no entiende. Bien. Bueno, la psicolingüística lo que hace en general es tratar de buscar evidencia empírica de respaldo para esas afirmaciones, convertir esas afirmaciones sueltas en el aire en hipótesis de trabajo y tratar de buscar, recolectar datos para ver si esas hipótesis están respaldadas o no están respaldadas por la evidencia empírica. Bueno, y ahí fuimos. Una cosa interesante para que tengan en cuenta es que en América Latina es llamativo que existen pocos trabajos empíricos o académicos sobre este fenómeno. Existen mucho debate público, existe mucha producción de manuales, de guías, sobre todo en el ámbito público, en las instituciones educativas, pero no había hasta el momento evidencia de respaldo respecto de qué pasaba cuando nos vinculábamos con textos o oraciones que tuvieran marcas o variantes morfológicas que no pertenecieran al paradigma binario de género del español. Entonces, el primer trabajo que hicimos fue un trabajo que implicaba una tarea de juicios de aceptabilidad. Una tarea de juicios de aceptabilidad implica que las personas tienen que tener una respuesta consciente sobre lo que uno les pregunta. Uno les pregunta, ¿aceptás en una escala Likert del 1 al 5, por ejemplo, cuánto esta forma sintáctica? Un sintagma como los plomeros, como las plomeras o como les plomeres, ¿sí? O como plomeros con X. esto por supuesto fue hecho por escrito. Y entonces, en esa tarea que supone procesos conscientes y que está fuertemente mediada por las creencias, no solamente respecto del género, de las identidades de género, sino también por las ideologías lingüísticas, esta idea de el lenguaje no se mancha, etc. Bueno, ahí sí aparecía que la aceptación era menor en el caso de las formas no binarias, ¿sí? Y los varones aceptaban menos que las mujeres esas formas no binarias o variantes no binarias. Pero además había una escala interesante con la que empezamos a probar el factor de estereotipicidad en relación con que las palabras que tenían una alta asociación con varones, ¿sí? Es el caso de lo que ustedes tienen en el gráfico como estereotipicidad alta, eran menos aceptadas las formas no binarias que en el caso de, por ejemplo, sintagmas como los niños o les niñes, en donde la vinculación con varones o con mujeres era más baja, ¿sí? Era más fácil representar grupos mixtos o sin género uniforme. Entonces dijimos, bueno, está bien, esto ocurre cuando tengo que hacer un juicio consciente sobre esas formas. ¿Qué pasa cuando tengo que leer oraciones, comprenderlas y generar una referencia, construir una referencia para ese sintagma? Y entonces hicimos un experimento de comprensión de oraciones donde medimos tiempos de reacción, tiempos de lectura, tiempos de respuesta y tipo de respuesta, en donde participaron un poco más de 538, pero quedaron finalmente en la muestra 538 participantes, en donde los hacíamos leer oraciones como estas, ¿sí? De baja estereotipicidad, como los niños siempre empiezan el jardín con un periodo de adaptación inicial, de media, utilizando los cocineros, por ejemplo, como sintagma de estereotipicidad media, y de alta, utilizando sintagmas como los plomeros, ¿sí? A lo cual se sumaba, después de cada lectura de la oración, una pregunta para ver cuál era la construcción de referencia que se había hecho de ese sintagma, ¿sí? Y estas tres tipos de oraciones se presentaban con las tres variantes, ¿sí? De género, de morfología de género. O, masculino genérico, E y X. ¿Qué nos encontramos? Esto ya está publicado, así que esto sí lo pueden leer. Hay algunos que están en prensa, otros que ya salieron, etc. Hay distintas etapas del periodo de publicación, pero lo que pueden ver en este gráfico es que, en principio, las dos variantes con formas no binarias no conllevan mayores tiempos, al revés, conllevan menores tiempos, que aunque en este caso, en esta muestra, la diferencia no fue estadísticamente significativa, nominalmente vemos que no hay ningún obstáculo en la lectura. Es decir, no produce un problema presentar sintagmas en formas no binarias, ¿sí? Pero además, cuando vamos a la construcción de referencia, empezamos a ver lo que es un poco la frutilla de este estudio, que es lo fuertemente modulado, condicionado que se encuentra el proceso, tanto de construcción de referencia como del tiempo en el que lleva elegir una referencia adecuada, por la estereotipicidad de los nombres de rol. ¿Qué quiero decir con esto? Que cuando tenemos nombres de rol, y así se les llama usualmente a esta idea de nombres que refieren, por ejemplo, a profesiones altamente asociadas, ¿sí? Con varones o con mujeres, cuando tenemos nombres de rol fuertemente asociados, en este caso con varones, como los plomeros, la O no funciona como un genérico. Las personas no logran adecuadamente representar varones, mujeres y otros géneros. En cambio, cuando presento ese mismo sintagma de los plomeros con formas no binarias, las personas inequívocamente construyen representaciones de género no uniforme. Entonces, las formas no binarias se desacoplan de la atracción que provoca la estereotipicidad pragmática del nombre de rol, ¿sí? Entonces, es interesante ver que las formas no binarias podrían estar funcionando como una forma especializada justamente y no ambigua, que es la ambigüedad que tiene el masculino genérico entre masculino exclusivo o masculino genérico, de referir a grupos sin género uniforme, incluso con nombres que están fuertemente asociados a una identidad sexogenérica o a otra.
Gaby, perdón, no sé cuánto más te queda, si podés ir ya
Sí,
redondeando,
ahí
así nos
vamos.
queda un ratito para preguntas. Gracias.
Solo vamos a esto que quiero mostrar específicamente, que me parece interesante destacar. Verificamos también si había algún vínculo con los usos espontáneos del lenguaje inclusivo, ¿sí? Es decir, hasta qué punto las personas que reportaban usar mucho lenguaje inclusivo de manera cotidiana en sus vidas, tenían una diferencia en la comprensión. Y lo que vimos es que, por un lado, la comprensión de las formas no binarias no estaba condicionada, ¿sí?, por el uso espontáneo del lenguaje inclusivo. Pero por el otro, en el segundo gráfico, lo que pueden ver es que lo que sí empieza a ocurrir es que las personas que dicen usar mucho el lenguaje inclusivo aceptan cada vez menos el masculino genérico como válido para representar grupos con género no uniforme, ¿sí? Se resemantizan ese masculino como, esto no me está sirviendo para referirme a grupos que tienen más de un género. Para eso tengo la no binaria. Entonces empiezo a aceptar mucho menos la O genérica para referir a grupos mixtos. Entonces, de alguna manera, algo de ese uso espontáneo, si bien, aunque no lo uses, lo comprendes perfectamente, cuando lo empiezas a usar mucho, empieza a generar algunos efectos sobre cuánto aceptás lo que antiguamente se aceptaba como masculino genérico, refiriendo de manera uniforme a cualquier grupo. Bien, entonces, para ir un poco hacia el final, lo que yo les quiero mostrar es una cosa interesante, muy rápidamente, que encontramos cuando cuando hicimos la colaboración, que sigue en pie, digamos, seguimos con la colaboración con Chile. Lo que vemos es que hay distinciones entre las comunidades lingüísticas. Y esto nos hace ver que este fenómeno tiene una pata sociolingüística y de variación tan fuerte que no solo lo tenemos que estudiar en términos de cada lengua, también lo tenemos que estudiar en términos de las comunidades lingüísticas, porque hay factores sociolingüísticos, pragmáticos, culturales, que modifican mucho la conducta de los hablantes y las formas que tienen de aceptación o de rechazo de algunas de estas propuestas de lenguaje inclusivo de género. Entonces, no solo nos tenemos que quedar con las diferencias interlingüísticas, sino que también tenemos que analizar las diferencias entre variedades dentro de la misma lengua, ¿sí? Bien, esto es simplemente un repaso de las conclusiones parciales que yo les fui diciendo a lo largo de la presentación, ¿sí? Uno de los elementos es, bueno, hay una forma no binaria que refiere inequívocamente a grupos con género no uniforme y no es más costosa. El uso espontáneo de formas no binarias no se requiere para comprender, pero sí puede afectar la forma en la que aceptamos nuevamente el masculino genérico, y finalmente hay diferencias entre comunidades lingüísticas que hay que analizar con más profundidad. Referencias bibliográficas solo algunas, y no quiero dejar de mencionar al equipo que está trabajando en todos estos experimentos, ¿sí? Junto conmigo, 4 grandes profesionales, y por supuesto, para lo que quieran, agradezco y estoy abierta a cualquier pregunta, sugerencia, quejas que tengan para hacer. Pueden escribirme o buscar nuestros trabajos en las redes que están Open Access. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, muchas gracias. Creo que estamos todas, todos y todes de acuerdo con que fue un montón de información. Me sentí un poco interpelada en el momento del todas y todes, porque yo hago eso, o trato de hacerlo. Así que muchas gracias, espectacular. Ya empiezan a aparecer en el chat los gracias espectaculares. Voy a pasar a las preguntas, porque no quiero que nos retrasemos, pero no quería dejar de agradecerte. Voy retomando las preguntas que fueron apareciendo. Voy a arrancar con una que hace Gabriel, que me parece interesante, que es, ¿sería posible, y él pone y positivo, enseñar la lengua desde cero a partir de lo no binario? O sea, ¿podemos pensar hipotetizar acerca de si eso sería posible?
Bueno, hay una cosa interesante que dice Gabriel, que es enseñar la lengua, ¿no? La lengua la adquirimos sin necesidad de instrucción explícita. Entonces, dado a esa situación, digamos, lo que enseñamos en general cuando entran las niñas a la escuela es a concientizar algunas características de la lengua que adquirieron, es decir, a volver consciente. Conocemos la conciencia fonológica, por ejemplo, como parte de esa concientización. Lo único que hacemos es volver conscientes algunas reglas gramaticales que ya adquirimos, pero las niñas saben concordar en género cuando adquieren la lengua, no tienen que entrar a la escuela para aprender eso. Entonces, lo que yo diría es que en principio no sabemos qué ocurrirá si una niña nace en un contexto de una comunidad lingüística en donde tiene como estímulo lingüístico primario esa nueva forma morfológica E. ¿Cómo la va a interpretar? Hay algunas hipótesis que por ahí dicen la va a reemplazar por la O, es decir, la E va a reemplazar toda la O, y no podemos decir que sí o que no. En este momento, el otro día estaba hablando con una colega lingüista, estamos parados o paradas o parades, según cada uno quiera denominarse, sobre un cambio lingüístico. Y los cambios lingüísticos no son teleológicos, no sabemos hacia dónde va a ir. Entonces tampoco podemos predecir cómo van a interpretar las niñas ese estímulo lingüístico primario cuando yo a un bebé, supongamos que sea un bebé varón, cis, hasta ese momento, o que creamos que lo sea, le diga, sí, les nenes del jardín, ¿sí? Todavía no sabemos cómo se va a dar ese movimiento y esa proyección. En este momento todavía son usos conscientes y voluntarios de estas nuevas formas de innovación morfológica. Hay algunos indicios de que en algunos casos, con algunos sintagmas, por ejemplo, utilizados en la forma del vocativo, chiques, alumnes, está volviéndose un poco más subliminal, no lo estamos pensando tanto, pero son todavía elementos muy, muy preliminares.
Es espectacular, ¿no? Estamos como viviendo el cambio, hay que esperar. Bien, tomo una pregunta de Cristian ahora que dice, en algunos casos el uso de la E como inclusivo aparece para representar a las identidades no binarias, alumna, alumne, alumno, y en otros casos la E se usa para referirse a todo el colectivo, sin hacer una marca de género específica, como todes, les, alumnes. Dice, estamos cerca de que el lenguaje inclusivo, me gusta, sobre todo porque lo conozco a Cristian, se ordene como con una estructura un poco más clara que pueda ser enseñada en instituciones educativas y no solamente usado?
Creo que por ahora no estamos cerca. Es digamos, lo que trae Cristian es lo que yo rápidamente mencioné, en que en todo el mundo se ve este desequilibrio o esta asimetría respecto de que las comunidades lingüísticas en general están adoptando con mucha mayor facilidad los usos genéricos, es decir, plurales en sintagmas en plural para referir a grupos sin distinción de género, que para hacer un uso individualizante de personas que no se autoperciben dentro del paradigma de género binario. Y eso se ve en casi todas las propuestas. Y para mí es el próximo paso de investigación. De hecho, es lo que hemos hablado en una de las líneas de cómo seguir con el equipo. Porque en ese caso vamos a tener uno de los usos interesantes es justamente la visibilización de identidades no binarias. Y entonces, si solo restringimos los usos de la E a el genérico, nos terminamos quedando en una invisibilización subliminal en principio. Respecto de la normatización o de la sistematización de los nuevos usos, hay un debate entre lingüistas muy fuerte en este momento en relación con, por ejemplo, armar manuales, no armar manuales, armar hojas de estilo, no armar hojas de estilo, me tienen que decir cómo usarlo, no me tienen que decir cómo usarlo. En general, sabemos que la variación en los usos de la lengua es la ley de todas las lenguas, es lo que ocurre por defecto. Contrario a lo que en general algunas ideologías lingüísticas creen, que la lengua es estable, fija, pétrea, que no se puede mover, que no hay que destruirla, la lengua varía continuamente. Hay variaciones sincrónicas, es decir, en el mismo momento, y variaciones diacrónicas, como propias del cambio lingüístico durante muchos años.
Claro.
Entonces, la voluntad de estabilizar los usos lingüísticos, en principio, es una voluntad normativista que una lingüista, como yo, te diría que es difícil, es alguna idea de algunas instituciones, pero que en el uso comunitario de la lengua no tiene una proyección real.
Bien, sí. Creo que Cristian se va a sentir muy contestado. Bien, después hay algunas preguntas que las voy a pasar porque creo que digamos que las fuiste contestando incluso cuando seguías con la presentación. Preguntaban si había estudios realizados en Argentina. 𝘱𝘪𝘯𝘦 ahora te viste que lo presentó. Y una pregunta interesante de Malena es, ¿hay estudios, o sea, está cuantificado cuánto se usa el lenguaje inclusive por grupo etario en Argentina? ¿O en otras partes del mundo, agrego yo?
Casi no está, en algunas otras partes del mundo está cuantificado, digamos, por grupo etario, incluso por grupo socioeconómico, por nivel educativo. En la Argentina no tenemos, estamos con el equipo tratando de hacer tenemos un gran estudio en nivel educativo secundario y universitario respecto de la percepción de sesgos de género en la lengua, y el uso de formas inclusivas de género. También estamos trabajando con docentes en Capital Federal, en principio para que nos digan si efectivamente se usa en las aulas o no se usa en las aulas, porque todavía nos falta, diría, información poblacional de esto. ¿En qué lugares, con qué restricciones? Hay mucha diferencia entre el ámbito público y el ámbito privado, entre el ámbito de familiaridad y los ámbitos formales, ¿sí? Las universidades en general fueron tendiendo a habilitar usos, y entonces en las aulas universitarias se ve mucho el uso del lenguaje inclusivo, pero no pasa tanto, me da la impresión, en secundario y en primario todavía. Entonces, me parece que nos faltan todavía datos para hacer un mapa global de cuál es el fenómeno en este momento. Una cosa sí interesante que nosotros vimos en los estudios que hicimos de procesamiento es que esperábamos encontrar una distinción clara en nivel educativo, es decir, dijimos, bueno, por ahí lo encontramos restringido a un grupo de universitarios. Y no fue así. Es decir, los usos del lenguaje inclusivo están más transversalizados de lo que pensábamos, y lo que sí necesitamos ver es una muestra controlada de grupos etarios, porque sí nuestra muestra parece estar traccionada por una franja etaria. Si bien tenemos gente de 80 y pico de años, no es la mayoritaria, ni está equilibrado un grupo de, por ejemplo, adultos mayores entre 70 y 85, y entonces sí puede estar traccionado por grupos de edades menores, ¿sí? Pero eso es una de las deudas de este fenómeno complejo que me parece que todavía nos hace falta entrarle desde distintas perspectivas.
Sí, muy bueno. Dada la hora, lo mismo, seguiría con vos, pero voy a cerrar con dos cositas. Voy a tomar una pregunta que hizo María, que lo voy a relacionar con lo que acabas de decir, y después te voy a pedir que nos des como el mensajito final. María pregunta, ¿qué deberíamos usar entonces? Ella pregunta con nuestros estudiantes en el aula. Y entonces yo agrego, ¿necesitamos estos datos que vos estás mencionando? ¿Necesitamos más investigaciones para empezar a tomar decisiones adentro de la escuela? ¿O ya tenemos algo como para poder empezar a decirle a los que piensan la política educativa, che, por ahí es por acá, empecemos a mirarlo para este lado?
Creo que tenemos muchos datos suficientes para poner el tema en debate. Lo que me parece que la peor opción posible me parece que es ir por la prohibición. Ir por la prohibición de determinados usos me parece la peor opción posible. Por lo cual, yo la pregunta la respondería, haría otra pregunta. ¿Debemos usar una u otra forma? Es decir, la forma deóntica, me parece que acá hay que ponerla en cuestión. No debemos usar ni una forma ni la otra. En principio tenemos que ser conscientes y poder llevar a las aulas con nuestros estudiantes y favorecer la reflexión sobre qué sentidos estamos proyectando cuando usamos una u otra forma. ¿Qué derechos estamos respetando cuando usamos una u otra forma? ¿Qué derechos no estamos respetando cuando usamos una u otra forma? ¿De qué manera nos podemos vincular con otros tratando de respetar los derechos de todos esos otros. Es decir, la lengua en términos del aula como una forma de vínculo interpersonal que tenga en cuenta más a las personas que a la estructura normativa que nos baja, por ejemplo, la Real Academia Española. Y creo que en ese sentido, la frase que vos decís de, bueno, ¿con qué irnos? Es, la lengua no necesita cuidado, pero las personas necesitan cuidado. Entonces creo que el foco tiene que correrse a el respeto de las emocionalidades, las subjetividades de esas personas que tenemos adentro del aula. Y creo que la evidencia empírica que tenemos nos habilita a empezar a poner sobre el tapete la posibilidad de pensar que la lengua necesita menos protección que las personas que tenemos enfrente. Eso creo que es lo más importante de tener esa evidencia.
Bueno, espectacular, espectacular. Acá me dicen alta frase, creo que es una, es una manera de cerrar. Muchas gracias, creo que nos dejaste un montón de datos. Va a estar esto en YouTube, así que pueden hacer frenar en ese momento para hacer capturas de pantallas para toda la información. Infinitas gracias, Gaby, por haberte sumado. Bueno, y estás de nuevo más que invitada a seguir con nosotros.
Me quedo. Gracias a ustedes y espero, bueno, y cualquier cosa me escriben, a disposición. Muchas gracias, Ceci, y acá me quedo escuchando a Sharon, por supuesto.
Bien, muchas gracias. Bueno, so I'm going to go back, not for the last time during this symposium, and I'm going to switch back to English to present the closing talk for this symposium, and I'm honored and I'm really happy, as I told her yesterday, to present her and to welcome Sharon Lamb to this moment. Hi Sharon, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure. Sharon is an amazing researcher, and I think that her talk is the best way to finish this symposium, because I think that she's going to take everything that we have been talking and discussing during the symposium, and it's going to take it to the next level. So for those who don't know her, and as I told before, for Susan and for Gabriela, you should go and look for her. Sharon is a professor of counseling psychology in the Department of Counseling and School Psychology of UMass Boston. Sharon is a co-author, and she has written, editor, and again co-authored more than 12 books, and she has numerous articles on girlhood, on sexual development and sexual victimization. She is the co-author of the American Psychological Association Task Force report on the sexualization of girls, that I have to read, I'm sorry, I didn't remember, as well as the APA guidelines for psychological practice with girls and women. Her book, Sex Ed for Caring in Schools, Creating an Ethics-Based Curriculum, which was published by Teachers Colleague Press, is impressive again, and I think that it's not in English. It's only in English, sorry, but that could be a question for Sharon if we could find it in Spanish also for our audience. And again, if you don't know it, go and look for it. In this, she presents her curriculum, the Sexual Ethics for a Caring Society curriculum. Doctora runs a research lab on, as I told you, University Mass Boston. She called the Sexual Ethics Research Lab, and her current research there involves focus groups on young adults discussing the limits of consent and the meaning of mutuality in sexual encounters. So I think that she's always like getting into the difficult places and the things that we should be talking about, but it's quite difficult to approach. So I applaud you for that. And one more thing that I want to share with you is that she has an amazing podcast. I'm a huge fan of podcasts, but she's in the top 3 list, which is called Sex and Ethics. And I think that is the next thing that you should go and listen after this symposium. That's how good it is. So thank you for that. Also, she's always sharing information. She's a really good speaker. So I think that it's going to be an amazing way to finish the day. Today she will be talking about sexual ethics and sex education. So thank you very much, again, Susan, for participating in this event. And the Zoom is all yours.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen right now, and also just thank you, Cecilia, for inviting me, and for your planning committee for seeing this as appropriate. Sounded like you all just heard a very exciting lecture on gender pronouns and gender diversity. I know a little Spanish, so I wish I could have heard that in English. Anyway, these are the people I thank for the work on sexual ethics. And I know that time is short, and I'll try to end by 1:45 so that we have 15 minutes for questions. Okay, so let's see, I'll do it this way. Oops, now I gotta go 2. Okay, sex education in the US. Oh, and by the way, if you need to ask me a question in the middle of this, I've made your faces very small, and I might not see the chat. So just unmute yourself and say, "Excuse me," and I'll answer your question in the middle. Okay, so let me explain what sex education in the US has been like. It's represented by this pendulum swing from the left to the right, to the left to the right. And guess where we are now? I'm sure you're guessing correctly. The left, liberals, radicals, see themselves as non-judgmental, sex positive, LGBTQ inclusive, and protective. And those on the right, or conservatives, see themselves as ethical, sex positive, non-LGBTQ inclusive, and also protective. Now, the right sees the left as relativists, meaning like anything goes for them, that they're promoting LGBTQ quote unquote lifestyles, that they're not protective, that they're not ethical, and that they're harmful. And the left sees the right as primarily fundamentalist, as hypocrites, as unprotective, as closed-minded, and also as harmful. The right fears that progressives will promote an LGBTQ agenda, and that they'll teach children that sex is meaningless or that anything goes. And the left fear that the right will shame young people about sex and sexuality and gender, and that the right will take away their rights. This is the version of what the right think that the left is promoting. It's a picture from Woodstock. And it's not entirely unfair, because some very famous liberals, the sexual predator Harvey Weinstein, promotes this idea. He to defend his predatory behavior, he actually said he came of age in the 60s and 70s where the rules were different, and that was the culture then. So what do progressives need to learn by this dynamic? They need to learn that sexual freedom isn't the same as celebrating casual sex, that it doesn't mean that liberals have no moral judgment on sexual issues, that starting from an ethic of do no harm might be a better place to start than a focus on rights, and that religions have some sex positive ideas. Finally, that everybody wants to protect kids. So when I was looking for my curriculum, I was looking for some common ground. I started writing this in a period of conservatism, and I wanted to find a curriculum that conservative parents and liberal parents would be able to support together, because who's against ethics? Everyone wants their children to grow up to be ethical human beings. to ask questions about how they should live, what humans ought to do, to talk about virtues, about rights, obligations, fairness, loyalty, compassion, to be talking about a system of moral principles. And so I wanted to bring ethics for young people into sexual relationships, but also into sex education. I say I wanted to steal back ethics because only conservatives were using the language of ethics at that time. And so I made the case that sex ed shouldn't only address health, but should also address ethics. And when I say ethics, I think of three things: personal responsibility, the other person, ethical treatment of your sexual partner, and ethics in society, which is sexual citizenship. What should we as a society endorse for sexual ethics? Laura, I see you raised your hand. Go ahead.
No, las personas que están participando les pido que escriban en el chat porque cerramos el webinar para poder grabarlo. Susan, perdón, Sharon, perdón.
Okay, I'll just keep going on and you can take your questions.
Exacto, no te preocupes.
Okay, so let me just give you a little history of sex education in the US. Back in 100 years ago, if you taught about venereal disease, they were afraid that if you taught about it, that girls would then choose to be celibate or even lesbians instead of heterosexual and investing in family life. So they didn't want teachers to teach about venereal disease. Then from the 20s through the 40s, science ruled. This is where the phrase, the birds and the bees, came about, that sex was seen as something very powerful and deserving of respect, and children were taught to make wholesome decisions based on facts. This, in the 1960s, SICUS, the major organization for sex education in the US, emphasized teaching just the facts so that nobody could disagree with them. And that led to a conflict in the 1960s, along with many other conflicts between liberals and conservatives, about the family life curriculum. So the family life curriculum that came about through the 50s and into the 60s was a very liberal curriculum where babies were brought into the classroom, that children were taught about all kinds of sexual issues in the family. And it was met with protest by the John Birch Society, which is kind of like the Ku Klux Klan, that argued that the school was not a place to teach, as you can see, raw sex. In response to that, in the 70s, and in response to the family life curricula, abstinence-only education took hold. And the abstinence only until marriage, 𝘍𝘭𝘶𝘦, I'll say it in Spanish and English, before marriage, they taught that it was wrong ethically, but also for health reasons. So an 𝘍𝘭𝘶𝘦 curriculum would teach that it's an expected standard and that it also would cause health problems. And the reason why they focused on health problems was because the just the facts perspective had lots of statistics that would show that it's not very healthy for young people to not have sex education. So then 𝘍𝘭𝘶𝘦 curricula got more and more supported. In the 1980s, it was only 1 in 50 sex ed programs that taught abstinence only. And it increased over time. By the late 90s, 86% of schools required abstinence to be promoted. And I hear that in Argentina, that abstinence is the rule there too. Of those schools that taught abstinence, a third of them taught that abstinence was the only means of contraception. And you might be familiar with the miseducation about condom use, that it doesn't work, and people, it's not 99% or 98% effective as claimed. It's not 98% effective as claimed because kids aren't taught to use it correctly. But if they were taught to use it correctly, it would be 98% effective or greater. In 1996, a Democratic president wrote in an act that gave $50 million a year towards abstinence education. And in 2001, George Bush had an act that said that schools could outsource sex education to communities, which meant that the government was giving money to after-school programs and churches even to teach abstinence. So by 2009, there's $1 billion to abstinence only until marriage education, until Obama was elected. And then we swung to the other side, and he called for evidence-based sex ed and ended all the funding to abstinence only until marriage education in 2016, right before he left office. Now, you might think that was a win to have evidence-based sex ed. And I'll just pass through this. These are the tenets of abstinence-only education. Well, maybe I should just say, I'll tell you in a minute why I don't like evidence-based sex ed. But here, this was the act in 1996 that said what needed to be in education. And as you know, it was, abstinence from sex outside of marriage, but also that a mutually faithful monogamous relationship in the context of marriage was the expected standard. And there was a lot of fear-mongering by conservatives at this time that sex education undermines parental rights, normalizes oral and anal sex, promotes homosexual behavior, promotes mutual masturbation or solo masturbation, eroticizes condom use by putting it on a banana, I don't know, but promotes gender confusion, undermines traditional values and beliefs. All of these things were presented as the problems with sex education for children. And the liberals then targeted all of that misinformation with evidence. So if you go back to here, many of these things can be subjects of research studies, and they were. And it turned out that sex education did none of these things. We might have taught children about sexual pleasure. On the other hand, most parents are not against that. So the liberals targeted abstinence only until marriage education with evidence that focused on disease and prevention. Okay, and if you're focusing on disease and prevention, you're going to measure the success of your program through three things: prevention of pregnancy, prevention of disease, and delay of first sex. And by doing the research on this, they showed that sex education does prevent pregnancy, it does prevent disease, and it does delay first sex. But what's the problem with the prevention model? Well, first, it implies sex is problematic and dangerous, and so you need to have sex education to prevent this big danger. And this, of course, plays into the false information from the right. It positions schools as risk-conscious places instead of growth places. If you think about what sex education could be when you're risk-conscious versus growth-conscious, there would be a whole set of other topics. It's also valueless. They take no position on whether sex is right or wrong. They're just teaching you to be careful so that 1, you don't get pregnant, 2, you don't get a disease, and 3, you don't have sex till you're old enough. And it also has a self-focus that instead of focusing on the other person and how to treat another person, or even prevent disease in another person, you're focused on yourself, which isn't a very ethical position. Finally, it ignores that sex takes place against a myriad of social influences. That's a neoliberal context. A neoliberal context focuses on the responsibility to oneself. It comes from economics, where the economic theory favors free trade, privatization, little government intervention, and most importantly, reduced public expenditures on social services. Every person to themselves. Neoliberalism in the social sciences focuses on a hyper-individualism, and a focus then, its corollary is a focus on choice. Everyone is seen as a hyper chooser that must choose the best for themselves, such that if anything goes wrong for a person, if somebody ends up in jail, if somebody ends up pregnant, it's all their own fault. They didn't make the right choice. And you'll hear lots of curriculum named things like make the right choices, personal choices, it's up to you, personal responsibility. When you talk about ethics, you think about responsibility to other people, but sex education hasn't focused on that. Okay, it's had a discourse of personal psychology, agency, and choice. So what's wrong with agency and choice? Well, when background conditions of inequality are ignored, when there are power differentials between different genders, among people of different races and ethnicities, then seeing any problem as one's personal problem lets the rest of society off the hook. Under neoliberalism, conditions of inequality are never considered when you talk about exploitation or problematic behavior. So, for example, take about our telling a girl not to walk alone at night, okay? That's a personal solution to a cultural problem of male raping, right? Society needs to do something to protect girls so that they have the freedom to walk at night. Society needs to do something to educate males or punish people who rape so that there are more societal restrictions around that. But to make it a matter of individual choice, oh, she was raped, she made a bad choice, is a neoliberal ethic. Okay, to tell you a little bit more about neoliberalism, here's a study by 𝘱𝘪𝘯𝘬 Chang and her student at SUNY Buffalo. She asked college-aged women to describe problematic and sometimes non-consensual sexual experiences. And basically, they didn't call these experiences rape, although they would take a survey and they would describe something that you or I would say, oh, that was rape. They, in so many ways, try to circumvent victimhood and ignore the unequal power dynamics and assert themselves as choosers, as self-determining neoliberal sexual agents. They minimize the negative effects of what happened to them, and they described what happened to them not as a rape, but as a quote unquote learning experience. See, they learned from that, and now they know better than to go back to somebody's dormitory room or something like that. But do you see, again, I'm trying to explain neoliberalism to people who haven't heard that phrase before, how damaging, even though we like this language of agent and empowerment and choices. It's very damaging unless you address the inequalities that exist in a society. So when you have autonomy promoting sex ed, a sex ed that says it's your choice, you have to make a healthy choice, and you're an agent, if a girl drinks too much and is raped, then, as happened in one of my classes, a 9th grader, that's somebody who's 14 years old, and all of the girls in the class said, well, that was her fault. She drank too much. She made that choice. And everybody let the person who raped her off the hook. Okay, because that's the neoliberal perspective, that the only people responsible when something goes wrong is the person who made a quote unquote bad choice. Here are some philosophers who are critics of choice. Harry Brighouse, philosopher of education, says choices are not autonomous when individuals accommodate their choices to unjust background conditions. And Paula McAvoy said, can choices be autonomous when they're constrained by unjust circumstances? So the answer is that sex education needs to include discussions of social conditions under which sex occurs. It needs to be a sociology, a psychology, an anthropology, and a philosophy course where you talk about patriarchy, privilege, stereotypes, sexism, homophobia, hypersexualization by the media. You can't teach sex without the context. And it's not that I don't think autonomy is important. I've written a lot about autonomy and respect for persons, but I think that care should be no less a moral requirement. And the ethic of care takes in the social conditions and particularities of the person. So, and what about consent? Autonomy leads to a focus on consent. It comes from a rights-based ethic, but it's problematic as a primary focus. It can disregard gender. It can overlook more subtle powers of coercion. It can be blind to the socio-political context in which the sex is solicited. And it can ignore the overall well-being of the other person. It reinforces rather than reduces conditions of heterosexual and gender-based inequality, thereby continuing inequitable relationships between heterosexual men and women through sexual scripts. So some theorists have argued that consent alone is not enough for ethical sex. And most recently, I wrote with Sam Gable and Dorette de Ruyter that mutuality should be an equal standard for ethical sex, not secondary, but second and equal standard for ethical sex, asserting that caring attention given to a sexual partner is needed in addition to the presence of consent. We define mutuality from the philosopher Iris Murdoch's description of mutuality: a just and loving gaze directed upon an individual reality. It doesn't mean you have to love who you have sex with. It doesn't mean that you have to be in a relationship necessarily, but you have to have a just and loving gaze on the other person's reality. We believe that's a moral requirement, and that it must be mutual because there's rarely just one fixed initiator and one fixed responder. We also describe what caring is. We say that caring about somebody as a foundation to ethical sex means you have an obligation to know what is knowable about the other person, and that this knowledge one's required to know might be psychological and beyond what is shared. You are the other person isn't responsible to speak up and say no or yes. You are responsible to figure out if the other person is hesitant, if the other person is using the experience to get over some grief or get revenge on a boyfriend. You have to figure out what this means to the other person to the best of your ability, because it's your responsibility to the other person that you have sex with. And that's different than just saying, is consent valid? So we ask that you try to know what's knowable about the other person, that you screen other people for signs of discomfort or fear or pleasure or withdrawal. You take into consideration identities of individuals, and you pay attention to differences in power that may affect consent. So it's an ethical standard that requires sexual partners to exercise a duty of care towards each other and take into account some of the issues that consent alone may not: coercion, power differences, motivation. And if you see consent campaigns on campuses, what you're hearing is basically rights without care, the micromanaging of sex. You need to get consent for every little thing you touch or do. You often positions women as gatekeepers, or it positions them as people unable to be assertive, so need to be told to be assertive. It positions men as unable to read cues, and it doesn't make demands that people read the other person. The demand is all on you to say yes, no, no, yes. And what if people consent to acts that will harm them? Is that all good? No. So we don't want to privilege consent over mutuality. We want to privilege care over consent. So I have two curricula that I've written that focus on this. I'm only going to talk about the first one in the book that was mentioned, Sexual Ethics for a Caring Society. And if anybody here is interested in translating it into Spanish, I'm happy to, share the rights to it and have you take it forward in Spanish-speaking countries. The second curriculum is about bystanders in sketchy sexual situations and how to help teenagers step in. So the Sexual Ethics for a Caring Society curriculum, just to reiterate what I said before, teaches kids how to become sexual citizens, to consider their behaviors towards others, to think about sex from an ethics perspective, and to reflect and justify their positions of sex in society. And I didn't want to have a dumbed down curriculum. Do you know that phrase, dumbed down? It's so many sex education curricula would have have teenagers rolling their eyes. The same kids who are on the internet watching shows like 𝘍𝘭𝘶𝘬 and sex education are being taught some of the stupidest dumbed down lessons about how to say no. It's beneath their dignity. And then, I try to combine consent and avoiding harm and mutuality. It looks like this if you go to the website. And these are the topics. So you can see in the topics, we talk about casual sex, and we talk about love, we talk about gender identity and coercion and the limitations of consent, media objectification, bodies and rights, pornography, have a new lesson on sexting, and a new lesson on Me Too. And we teach it from a applied philosophy tradition where teachers don't give their opinions, but they treat the class as moral deliberators who argue with each other. And it's kind of a democratic education principle that's non-dogmatic, inclusive, and that teaches critique of ideas tied to a process of shared governance in the classroom too. And we teach teachers to use a we voice, and that's what gets at how should we live in society. So if a student says, well, I believe this, but you can believe whatever you believe, we always move them to the universal and say, well, what would you think about a society adopting that view for everyone? Would you agree with that? Should we treat each other this way? Because as you know, teenagers are often afraid to tell somebody else their idea is wrong and their own idea is right. They have a live and let live perspective, at least in the US. So we set up the class in a way that teaches them it's okay to judge other people, and that we can judge other people without hurting them. The first lesson comes from a philosophy experiment called the Veil of Ignorance. I'll just tell you a little bit more about that. The kids are given identities that aren't their own. They might pick them out of a hat. And then they have to make up rules for the classroom that would protect whatever identity they were chosen. This is from a philosophy experiment about how to create a just society. You have to imagine you aren't born yet. And from this veil of ignorance, what would you want your society to be like? Because you don't know if you're going to be born poor or disabled, black or white. You don't know what will happen to you in life. So not knowing that, you would most fairly choose just laws. And we do some objectification using things about men as well as women in terms of sexual objectification, just a few of them. This is about sexualization of kids. Some of the ads are old, and some of the incidents we talk about are older, but they still produce a lot of discussion. This is on Miley Cyrus on the Kids Awards, where she did a pole dance, and we asked what the students think about self-objectification. What does it mean to be sexually free? What's appealing about artists who represent themselves as sexually free or liberated? Is there a difference between real sexual freedom and selling sexual freedom? As you can see, these are really philosophical questions that adults would enjoy talking about too. And we give in philosophy, you give a lot of hypothetical examples about, so in the objectification, where it's not just, oh, look at these bad ads, isn't this horrible? But we ask them, we give examples of gray areas. What if a woman who identifies as queer asks her partner to do a striptease for her? Is that objectification? Is it wrong? And so forth. We also look at objectification through hip hop, looking at how hip hop has treated women through 𝘨𝘭𝘶𝘕's lyrics about how Black men and women are buying into a sort of a self-objectifying stance, and comparing that to the minstrel shows, which is part of our history in the US. I don't know if it's part of your history too. We also try not to stay away from controversy. We actually have a lesson on abortion. This was, of course, before we lost the right to it in the US and in some states. I think that's the same as within Argentina, that different states have different policies, maybe. But we talk about, we don't have a perspective, of course, being a progressive, you might guess at my perspective, but we ask the students to think about whether, how they would advise their best friend who wanted an abortion. And we have them look at all these different values people might express and what kind of moral foundation, what kind of moral ethic they're expressing. Is it a care ethic? Is it an ethic about loyalty? Is it an ethic about justice? Because it's more important that they think about things as ethical decisions than that they come out with the right answer, the one I agree with during class. We have your body, your right discussion and human life is sacred discussion in class. And it's almost time to end. So I'll just say we did do some research on it. And there were issues of discussing these things in the neoliberalism classroom. And I won't give you total examples of this, but the girls, even though there were power differentials between rich and poor and racial and girls and boys, the students would always try to equalize power, such that if you were doing a lesson on rape and coercion, the girls would say, well, boys can get raped too. So there was this idea of not wanting to admit to injustice in the classroom. And as I call this, the neoliberal classroom, there was a lot of insistence that girls were responsible for whatever situations they got themselves into, no matter the coercion. And there was a lot of blaming of girls and not society, which was something that the teachers needed to address over time. And I'll just go through all these examples of it, since I want to give you time to ask questions. As I wrote here, nobody wanted to be a feminist, nobody wanted to be a victim when we taught this. Maybe kids are a little more activist now. Anyway, to conclude, the sexy works against a personal responsibility perspective. To take care of another person in a sexual encounter disrupts this idea that everyone ought to take care of themselves. And I think we need to also focus on vulnerability. I don't want to say that sex is incredibly special or makes everybody vulnerable, but I kind of want to say there's a lot of vulnerability in sex. And if you have to understand that the vulnerability is socially produced and differentially distributed, it challenges the idea that one's own choices can make one invulnerable. And then you might want to ask about pleasure in the sex ed curriculum. Is there a missing discourse of desire? Does desire mean empowerment? Is this the road to agency? I definitely think we talk about pleasure in the sex ed curriculum, but right now we live in a context where the media is showing the kids all sorts of sexual pleasure, realistic and unrealistic. What I think we want to teach them is something more about the pleasure for the other person, and how do we support pleasure in sex as a society. Not if it feels good, do it, and not don't feel guilty if you're doing what's best for you. We want to teach them what's good sex, how do you show respect, how do you not cause harm, when is pleasure good, because the potential for harm is high in the context of sexual inequality and gender hierarchy. There's a context of tacit approval for harmful acts in the media and pornography, like the choking of girls in sex acts. And a great number of individuals have experienced sexual trauma. How can we teach sex ed without acknowledging how much sexual trauma there is in the world? Anyway, so fight the rhetoric of self-care, be mindful of unequal background conditions that shape the discourse of sex. And yeah, I rushed through to have some time at the end, but thank you. And I'll leave this slide up a little bit as we.
Thank you very much. I think again, as with the previous presentation, you gave us a lot to think about. So let's just appreciate that. It was an amazing presentation. Thank you. I think I'm shocked about all the material that we should revise. And I'm going to start with one of my questions. I'm sorry, but because one thing that is stuck in my mind during your presentation is that I think that you are talking about a shift between teaching sex education, like, okay, this is a banana and this is a condom and that's how you do it, right? And you're pushing for a space that is more about, and you said it, right? Like a philosophical kind of questions, and let's think about this. And one, I don't want to say a problem, but one issue that we had in Argentina is who is teaching sex education and how we should prepare those teachers that are going to be standing in front of a class. And I'm guessing that if you are teaching, this is a condom and this is a banana, it's easier somehow that if you are presenting these dilemmas, these ideas that sometimes you're going to find yourself in a position of, I don't know. So how if you have any experience, how should we address that?
Well, I think you're right that the people who are teaching sex ed want to teach facts because they feel more comfortable with factual information. I also, when I was talking about dumbed down curriculum, I think that it's very easy to learn about how to use a condom, and you don't need 45 minutes on it. You don't necessarily need a demonstration either. That's just for the fun of the class. I mean, and I think that you can have in 1 or 2 days a nurse from the school come in and give you the health information. You could test them on it. Factual information isn't that hard to learn when you're motivated, right? And the students are very motivated to learn that sort of thing. But when you ask them what their questions are, are all over the place. And that's sort of more important, to get those, to find out what misinformation they've heard. The very first question I had from a girl in the class was, why do women scream during sex? Now, is that a factual question or is that an ethics question? There's so much to that question, right?
Yeah.
She said, does it hurt? Well, she's been watching movies and women have orgasms and they scream, and it doesn't quite look like pleasure for her. And also we know that there's a lot of exaggeration in movies. So you want to have a discussion about the media and why does the media portray it that way? And why is it important for women to have in the media, such outward big expressions of pleasure and a way that a man might judge his own masculinity by how much pleasure he brings to a woman. So it all gets into all of the sociology, psychology, and history of, gender relations within that one question. When a teacher could factually just said, well, most women don't scream and they're not screaming because it hurts, it's because it's pleasurable. The end, that wouldn't really address it all, would it?
Yeah, no, you're right. But I think that we all, as an older generation, I think that the problem is that sometimes teachers find themselves being asked questions that they haven't asked themselves, right? And I think that could be also like an issue. And I think that's why I was asking like how to handle the I don't know. Let me find out. Right? That's also changing the structure of power inside the classroom, and I think that's important.
Well, I think you bring up a really good point because teachers are isolated in this. There's the one teacher in this school, and if and if there could be some consortium of teachers who meet once a week to give peer supervision about what's going on in the classroom, then it becomes less of a personal responsibility and a societal one where people are working together to put out, the right information and to help kids think more sensitively about sex.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions that we have, and I'm going to take something that you said to link with this question. You said that you can take sex out of the context, right? And one of the questions that we have is something that happened in Argentina is that you're not supposed to share too much of your experience or your own, even, I don't know, condition in terms of who are you when you are teaching a sex education class. So one of the questions that we receive is how far is too far when you are trying to share your personal experience to get them involved, right? Because you talk about the we, and so it should be framed in terms of we and not in terms of this is what happened to me and it could happen also to you.
Oh, I actually think you shouldn't share your personal experience. And the reason why is twofold. The first one is that you're putting at risk our ability to teach sex education, and you're playing into the hands of people saying that we're trying to promote certain ways of being. Teachers are very powerful people. And if a parent doesn't like your views or is different, then it very easily could be discussed in terms of you're promoting something the parents don't like. So I think you should protect yourself and not share anything. But the other reason is that the students need to have more freedom to discuss their own views, and teachers are very powerful and they might presume things. So it's a kind of world right now where they have a lot of experiences of other people from TV and from, people in their life. Just about everybody has a gay person in their family these days. And so you don't have to use your own identity or your own experience to teach them. I think it's mostly protect yourself and protect the ability to teach sex ed by a veil of neutrality. And I want to hear your opinions, and I'm going to teach you how to argue with each other.
Nice, thank you. And Ignacio asked, in your opinion, why do some conservative sectors that identify with neoliberalism, who are pushing these ideas of individualism, or usually reject the decision of women having choices about their own bodies, for example, for interrupting a pregnancy? What are your thoughts about that duality, right? Like, is what you are doing with your body and what you should be taking care and what you should be worried about, or but then it moves into a different opinion when it's about their decisions about their bodies.
I can see how that somebody might argue that the right space talked about abortion is coming from a neoliberal perspective, but it also can be, if that's what the question is about, but it also can be discussed from a care perspective and do no harm. So it is harmful for a woman to not have rights, but it's also that we want to take care of women in our society and not impose pregnancies on women who don't want them. And that's a caring perspective. So you can use a rights-based ethic, you can use the care base, and you could say, we are a society, using that we voice, we are a society that doesn't impose moral decisions about abortions onto women, and hope that they can figure out the best way that will take care of themselves and their families for the future. That also, and their families, puts in mind to people that many women who have abortions are also mothers already. Okay, so, and they're not just choosing for themselves what's right for me, but they're choosing what's right for their family too.
Thank you. Something that Maria Jose is reminding me that I didn't tell you yesterday is that in Argentina, we don't have a special teacher who is teaching sex education. So pretty much everybody has to talk about that. So it's even more complicated, the situation here. And she's telling us that she teaches economics and she also has to talk about sex education. So it's even a more complex reality for us.
Well, it's all different all over the US. Some people in some more liberal states, there might be people from Planned Parenthood who come in and teach sex education. In some schools, it might be the school nurse. The joke is that for many schools, it's the gym teacher, physical education teacher that gets that.
Nice.
It's usually not and sometimes it's just a volunteer, whoever wants to. It could be the economics teacher. It could be the English teacher who wants to do it through literature.
Okay.
So yeah, it's different here, depending on what school and what state you're in.
Oh. And Leandro is asking about your opinion about which could be the criteria to choosing different topics to talk about sex education in different ages. Because you focus a little bit on adolescence, but do you have something to say before that? Like what topics could be important to be depending on the age of the students?
Well, I think it just sort of depends on what's happening and what's going on. I mean, certainly kids in like we call it middle school, like who are 11 and 12, understand bullying and understand coercion, and they need to learn about that can apply sexually too. I guess that's risk focused. But they're also seeing all sorts of things on TV about sex that might be of interest to them. So there's such a wide variation in knowledge about sex for like 10, 11, 12. Some 12-year-olds are having sex already. Some haven't even talked about it yet. That it's it's a school by school kind of thing. But is any topic off the issue is that conservatives are afraid you're going to teach kids about anal sex. I mean, there's a big one. They're always like so afraid of that, right? So, or that you're going to teach them to be gay. I mean, certainly you don't have to teach anybody about gender inclusivity in a sex education class. That could be in English or in history and everywhere. It could be in relation to the boy who wore a dress to school, like my grandson did in first grade. That should be an ongoing kind of discussion. So when do you give them the facts of life? I think that whenever the school nurse and the school decides to do that, the parents, inclusive say now is the time to give that, one session fact. But the talk about bullying and coercion and sexual harassment, that starts being important around ages 9 and 10, sadly.
Yes. Yes. And there's also the information that the age of consuming for porn has been going lower and lower. So I think that, so you find yourself talking about things that you maybe never even thought about talking with an 8-year-old, but I
think that the most important thing to get across in porn is how unrealistic it is, and that it's going to be very hard to enjoy sex if they get hooked on porn. They might think it's the opposite. Say it's going to be very hard for you to enjoy real sex. So if you give them, sex is pleasurable, you will want to enjoy it someday. Don't wreck that experience for yourself because somebody isn't conforming to what your expectations of pornography taught you. And I think you need to educate parents. And in fact, this is the best way to introduce sex education to your school and get the parents on board. And that say, I gave a talk in Monterrey, Mexico to very religious Catholic parents at a school. And I said, what do you want for your children's sex life when they grow up? What do you want for them? And they all said they want their children to enjoy sex. And they don't want them to be harmed by it. And they want them to have a loving partner. They all have the same goals. And so if you say, well, to do that, we're going to have to teach them about pornography because that's going to harm them right now. And to do that, we're going to have to teach them about taking care of other people and thinking about other people and having them think about the ethics of sex. So that's my goal, to take conservative parents and say, we're just going to talk about what's ethical, and hopefully they'll bring those conversations home to the dinner table. And then they laugh and say, no. The same parents that say it's up to the parents to teach kids about sex are also the same parents that say, I don't want to talk to them about sex.
Yes. Well, and to finish, as I asked the previous speakers, can you give me a take-home message, like a final remarks kind of thing to take home?
Well, I think don't give up the fight. There are ways to work around the divisions in society about sex education and keep looking for solutions that are best for you. Maybe I would say involve parents and support each other as you fight these fights to have very good discussions about sex.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon. It was an amazing presentation. People here is agreeing with me. Excelente, they say excellent. So thank you very much.
I don't know the word nivel.
Nivel is like I don't know what you, excellent, the like the level of the, the level of the conversations. Yes.
Excellent, I
high
guess.
level. He's saying like high level talk.
Great. Whoa.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
Oh,
I think
gracias.
that is, yeah, I started the symposium talking about how we need to have this conversation, we need to have this uncomfortable conversations in terms of we don't know the answers and we need to ask for more data. So thank you for bringing that to us today. Thank you very much.
Wow. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to finish in Spanish, so así me es más fácil concluir también. Creo que nada, que espero, en realidad no creo, espero que este simposio haya estado al nivel de sus expectativas. Yo estoy muy contenta con las 3 presentaciones que tuvimos, creo que fueron 3 charlistas de primerísimo nivel, muy contenta de poder traer gente de distintos lugares del mundo y también de sumar a nuestra propia producción a esta discusión, porque creo que tenemos gente local que está haciendo laburo que es muy bueno y que vale la pena ser levantado, mostrado y empujado. Llegamos al final, después de haber pasado por diferentes conversaciones, les dije que iban a ser incómodas, les dije que nos iba a interpelar, nos corren de los lugares comunes en los que solemos pensar las cosas, y creo que eso es lo más importante. Quiero terminar de nuevo agradeciendo, como arranqué, agradeciéndole a Susan, a Gabriela y a Sharon por las presentaciones, por el tiempo que le dedicaron a hacerlos, a les espectadores, y espero que esto de nuevo nos haya empujado a pensar las cosas con otra perspectiva. Creo que es importante, que es prioritario que sigamos teniendo estos espacios de discusión, y el compromiso del área de educación de la Universidad 𝘨𝘀𝘀 está puesto en eso, así que gracias por ayudarnos a hacer o esperemos que esto nos ayude a hacer un espacio más inclusivo y con más perspectiva de género. Quiero también agradecer digamos, a la gente que hizo que esto fuera posible, a la International Brain Research Organization, de nuevo, por darme la 𝘍𝘪𝘯𝘐 otra vez y confiar en que esto iba a suceder, y a la universidad, y de nuevo, especialmente a Ileana Minutela, a Verónica Stewart, a Julieta Goldstein, a 𝘨𝘭𝘶𝘦, a 𝘍𝘪𝘯𝘐𝘮, que realmente sin ellos y ellas esto no hubiese pasado, así que muchas gracias, y a todos, a todos ustedes por haberse sumado hoy. Espero que nos veamos la próxima, espero poder decir en el 3er simposio, no sé, veremos, espero que sí, y les invito a todos a pasar por nuestra página. Para quienes no conocían el simposio anterior, los invito a verlos porque también fueron presentaciones muy buenas, o para volver a ver y para encontrarse con la información y con la data que fueron mencionados, y para enterarse de lo próximo que venga. Así que bueno, muchas gracias y hasta la próxima.